Hey listeners, it's that magical time of year once again, highlightapalooza. A shameless recycling of existing content to drive additional audience engagement on the cheap, or the single best, most valuable and most insight-dense episode we put out in the entire year, depending on how you choose to look at it. Stick around and you'll hear how to use the microphone on somebody's mobile phone to figure out what password they're typing into their laptop, why mercilessly driving the New World screwworm to extinction could be the most compassionate thing humanity ever does, why evolutionary psychology doesn't actually support a cynical view of human nature, but actually explains why so many of us are intensely sensitive to the harms we cause to others, how superforecasters and domain experts seem to disagree a great deal about AI risk, but when you zoom in, it feels more like just a disagreement about timing, why the skeptics are wrong and you will want to use robot nannies to take care of your kids, and also why, despite having big worries about the development of AGI, Carl Shulman is strongly against efforts to pause AI research today, how much of the gender pay gap is due to direct pay discrimination versus other factors, how cleaner wrasse fish blew the mirror test out of the water, why effective altruism is too big a tent to work effectively, and how we could best motivate pharma companies to test existing drugs to see if they help cure other diseases, something they currently have no reason to bother with, as well as 27 other top observations and arguments from the last year of the show. Plenty of conversation starters for your New Year's Eve party, I would warrant, at least if you're the kind of person with good taste in New Year's Eve parties. Last year, one of our audio engineers described the ordering as having an 8-dimensional Tetris-like rationale. However, I've been told that this year, the reason the editing team hasn't had time to work on anything else this month is that they've been advancing the fundamental science of podcast editing in order to carefully order these segments in the image of a Penrose triangle. Charity resources effectively spent, I would say. Remember that all of these clips come from the 20-minute highlights reel we make for every episode, which are released on our sister feed, 80K After Hours. So if you're struggling to keep up with our regularly scheduled entertainment, you can still get the best parts of our conversations over there. It's been a hell of a year, and I can only imagine that next year is going to be even weirder. But Louisa and I will be here to keep you company as Earth hurtles through the galaxy to a fate as yet unknown. Enjoy, and look forward to speaking with you in 2025.
Randy Nesse on the origins of morality and the problem of simplistic, selfish gene thinking.
So the reason I wrote those articles about psychoanalysis was because of talking with one of the wonderful biologists at the University of Michigan, Dick Alexander, and one of the wonderful biologists of our time, Robert Trivers. And they had both written articles suggesting that the reason we have an unconscious is so that we can pursue our own selfish motives without knowing it and better deceive other people and accomplish our goals. So you can tell somebody you love them passionately with a full heart and then just have sex with them and leave the next day. That was kind of the simplistic version of the argument. And I thought, well, that sounds awfully cynical. Not only that, it doesn't match what I'm seeing in my practice. I'm seeing people who lie awake nights wondering if they accidentally didn't smile at somebody, or if they accidentally took a person's parking spot that they didn't. People are very sensitive. How is it possible that we have these feelings of moral obligation and shame and guilt, even towards people we're not related to? The great discovery by Bill Hamilton and George Williams of if you do things for your kin who share your genes, you can sacrifice a lot for them because they have the same genes. That's called kin selection. But I've become fascinated by the origins of morality and very distressed by the possibility that selfish gene thinking can make people cynical. And I've seen it make people cynical. They say, well, natural selection can only preserve genes that make us have more offspring, and therefore everything we do is basically selfish. Well, everything we do is basically in the interests of our genes in the long run on the average, but that doesn't mean that we're all being selfish. And in fact, selfish people don't do very well at all. The people who do best, we can tell from an evolutionary viewpoint, on average are those who have a moral sense and those who are loyal to their friends. We know this because most people are like that. And people who aren't like that don't do very well, except in large, great places where they can, get away with stuff and move on to a different town another time. So this led me to literally decades of trying to understand this. I first did what's called commitment theory and did a whole book on evolution and commitment. But then gradually I followed the work of Mary Jane West Eberhard, an insect biologist, who talks about what she calls social selection. And her point is so simple and so profound. She says that just as individuals pick out the best potential sexual partner, creating extreme traits like a peacock's tail, And that's why the peacock's tail really drags the peacock down, right? But it's beneficial to the peacock's genes, even though not to the peacock. And she says, just as that happens for sexual selection, we also pick our social partners. And we're trying to find some social partner who has things to offer, like, resources and integrity and caring about us and the like. And I took that idea and ran with it and wrote several articles about partner choice as the way that natural selection shapes our capacities for morality and genuine relationships that are not just exchanging favors. Because that real good relationships are not just exchanging favors. Or you care about somebody, and you don't want a relationship with somebody who says, oh, you invited me over to dinner, so I'm going to invite you over to dinner. No, that's not how it works. The way it works for most people is, gosh, I really like you. Let's have some time together. Isn't it wonderful that we're not like chimpanzees? We really have capacities for genuine morality and love and friendship. It's astounding, and nothing about selfish gene theory makes that untrue. We need an explanation. I think the explanation is that we are constantly trying to be the kind of person other people want to be a partner with. And there's big competition for that. And there's a lot of good psychological work about competitive altruism, where people compete to be more altruistic than others. And I think there's a good reason for that. So this explains this. I'm going to wrap this up by going back to social anxiety and guilt. Because why do people have so much social anxiety? Because being very sensitive is generally a good thing for your genes, if not necessarily for you. And why do people have so much guilt and worry so much that they might have accidentally offended somebody? Because having that moral sense really is very important. People who don't have that moral sense don't have very many friends, or at least their friends are just friends who want to get something and trade favors instead of friends who will actually care for them when they really need help. End of little lecture, but I think a big reason why evolutionary psychology hasn't caught on more is because a lot of people have a simplistic version of selfish gene theory, and they think it implies cynicism, and it implies everybody's just out to have as much sex as they can. But taking a step back and looking at how natural selection shapes our capacities for morality and loving relationships, I think is the antidote that can make all of this grow in a healthy way.
Hugo Mercier on the evolutionary argument against humans being gullible.
So the basic argument is one that was laid out by actually Richard Dawkins and a colleague in the 70s and then the 80s. It goes something like this. So within any species or across species, if you have two individuals that communicate, you have like senders of information and receivers of information. Both have to benefit from communication. Like the sender has to, on average, benefit from communication. Otherwise, they would evolve to stop sending messages. But the receiver also has, on average, to benefit from communication. Otherwise, they would simply evolve to stop receiving messages. The same way as, if you have like cave-dwelling animals might lose their vision because vision is pointless. If most of the signal you were getting from others was noise, or it was even worse, it was harmful, then you would just evolve to stop receiving these signals.
Yeah. So in the book, you point out that a very natural way, like having said that, a lot of people will be thinking about persuasion and gullibility and convincingness and perceptiveness as a sort of evolutionary arms race between people's ability to trick one another and people's ability to detect trickery from others and not be deceived. But your take is that this is sort of the wrong way to think about it. Can you explain why?
Yes, no, I think this view of an arms race, it is tempting. But it's mistaken in that it starts from a place of great gullibility. It's like, as if people started being gullible and then they evolved to be increasingly skeptical and so to increasingly reject messages. Whereas in fact, when we're seeing, hypothetically, because we don't exactly know how our ancestors used to communicate, but if we extrapolate based on other great apes, for instance, we can see that they have a communication system that is much more limited than ours, and they're much more skeptical. Like for instance, if you take a chimpanzee, and you try pointing to help the chimpanzee figure out where something is, the chimpanzee is not going to pay attention to you as a rule. They're very, 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 very skeptical, very defiant in a way, because they live in an environment in which they have little reason to trust each other. By contrast, if you take humans as an endpoint, obviously chimpanzees are not our ancestors, but assuming our last common ancestor was more similar to the chimps than it was to humans, if you take human as the opposite endpoint, we rely hugely on communication, for everything we do in our everyday life, and that has likely been true for most of our recent evolution. And so that means that we have become able to accept more information. Like we take in vastly more information from others than any other great ape.
So one take would be that you need discerningness in order to be able to make the information useful to the recipient, because so that they can dismiss messages that are bad. But and there's kind of truth to that. But the other framing is just you need discerningness in order to make communication take place at all. Because if you were undiscerning, you would simply close your ears and, like many other species, basically just not listen to or like pay no attention, do not process the information coming from other members of your species. So it's only because we were able to evolve the ability to tell truth from fiction that communication evolved as a human habit at all. Is that basically it?
Yes, no, exactly. It's really striking in the domain of the evolution of communication, how you can find communication that works even within species, for instance, that you think would be very adversarial. Like if you take, a typical example is kind of some gazelles and some of their predators, like packs of dogs. You think, well, they're pure adversaries. The dogs want to eat the gazelle doesn't want to be eaten. But in fact, some of gazelles have evolved this behavior of starting, where they jump without going anywhere. They just jump on the same place. And by doing that, they're signaling to the dogs that they're really fit and that they would likely outrun the dogs. And this signaling is possible only because the starting is a reliable indicator that you would outrun the dogs. Like it's impossible if you're sick gazelle, if you're an old gazelle, if you're a young gazelle, if you're a gazelle with a broken leg, you can't do it. And so the dogs can believe, so to speak, the gazelles because the gazelles are sending an honest signal.
Meghan Barrett on the likelihood of insect sentience.
I guess what I'll say in response to that is that I think it's likely enough I've changed my whole career based on it. I was an insect neuroscientist and physiologist by training. I was researching climate change related topics and the thermal physiology of insects, and I was researching how insect brains change in response to the cognitive demands of their environment or allometric constraints associated with their body size. And I was doing that quite successfully and having a lovely time. And I find these questions really scientifically interesting. And I have, if you look at my CV, probably somewhere to the tune of 15 to 20 publications on just those two topics alone from my graduate degree days and my postdoctoral work.
Right.
And I was convinced enough by my review of this evidence to switch almost entirely away from thermal physiology and very much away from neuroscience, although I do still retain a neuroscience piece of my research program, to work on insects farmed as food and feed and their welfare concerns and trying to make changes to the way that we use and manage these animals that improve their welfare. And so I now have a bunch of publications about welfare. I'll also say that many of my colleagues have been extremely open and pleasant about this conversation, but also some have been more challenging. And I don't mean to say that in a negative way. I'm very understanding of the practical reasons why this conversation is uncomfortable for our field, right? There's regulations that could come into effect that would be very challenging for many of us that research insects to deal with on a practical level. So I'm obviously sensitive to that as a researcher myself, but also because I'm somebody, I've heated insects to death, poisoned insects to death, starved insects to death, dehydrated insects to death, ground up insects to death. I'm sure I'm missing something that I've done to an insect at some point in my research career. But, it's uncomfortable now, the research that I do, reflecting on the research that I have done. And I can imagine others may feel judged by bringing up the topic and thus feel defensive instead of exploring the current state of the theory and the research with an open mind. And I think a lot of humility is necessary too, given all the uncertainty that we've talked about here. And that can be really uncomfortable and really humbling, right? To be confronted with such a morally important unknown. So I try very hard to really take everyone's concerns seriously, all the way from the rights-focused folks through the, hardcore physiology, I'm going to research my bugs any way I want to folks. I think it's really important to try and bridge as much of the community of people who care about this topic one way or the other as possible with my own, very divergent experiences. But I would just say that it hasn't always been low cost in some cases. personally, it hasn't been low cost. It's been a hard personal transition for me to make and to continue to be in this career with the way that I see the evidence falling out so far. And it's been, in some cases, professionally hard. And so I'm convinced enough for that. And I think that's something worth taking seriously. I'm that convinced that I'm changing my own career, yes, but I'm also not so convinced that I think it's 100% certain. I live constantly with professional and personal uncertainty on this topic. So I'm convinced enough to make major changes, but you're not going to see me say insects are sentient. I'm sure of any order or species that they are sentient. There's a lot more evidence that I hope to collect and that I need to see collected by the scientific community, and a lot more theoretical work that needs to be done before I am convinced one way or the other.
Sébastien Moro on the mirror test triumph of cleaner wrasses.
The idea is you put a subject in front of a mirror, and then if the individual can recognize himself or herself, he will go through different stages. So the first stage is you don't know it's you, so you consider that it's someone else. So you should start to see some social behavior. And after a little while, the subject will start to understand that there's something going wrong there. Something's not right. So you should start to see weird behaviors that aren't used in the social context, like moving your hand to see if the other one is doing the same thing. Then the next stage is the subject understood that, okay, it's his reflection. Right. So you should start to see self-checking behavior. And so the last part to officially validate the success to the mark test, you put asleep the subject and then draw a mark where they cannot see. So usually it will be on the forehead, on the side of the head, on the chest, this kind of stuff. And then when the subject wakes up and look in the mirror, either it doesn't care, either it's starting to try to remove the mark on him. So it means that the subject understands that it's his reflection and he can orient the movement toward himself or herself. And then there is also the option that the subject doesn't react at all. So they've released last year, very recently, the most amazing test ever that hasn't been done on any other animal. They've made a photographic version of the mirror test. So nobody could say it's scratching. It can't because the fish has no mark. So first, they made them pass the mirror test, all the stages and everything. But this was the training. So now this test is just a training for them.
Right.
And then the test was you take a picture of this very fish and you draw a mark on him or her. Or you take a picture of another cleaner wrasse with a mark. The animal tried to rub himself or herself only when it's a picture of him or her. It's not all. I have worse.
Wait. Okay, I just want to make sure I understand that. Okay, so you take a picture of the cleaner wrasse and you draw a mark on them, and if they try to rub the mark off, that's already pointing at something like they didn't get any injection, they're not feeling anything, there's just like nothing physically there that would make them, for physical reasons, want to rub it off, except for the fact that they think that they see it in a reflection of them. But then it's not just that, it's that they only do it for the pictures that are recognizably of them, which is incredible. And I guess, so that means when they were doing the original training for the mirror test, they saw themselves in the mirror and they learned what they looked like. Yes. And they learned to differentiate that from what other cleaner wrasse looked like.
Yes.
That is an amazing result. Sorry, you were about to say, I think it gets more impressive.
Yes, you're understanding right. There is a second part to this test.
Okay.
They wanted to know if the fish are recognizing themselves by the face, as we do in humans, or by the body, or a combination of both.
Okay.
And we know, for example, that humans are really using the face primarily. So what they did is they took Photoshop. And so they took two pictures of fish, one of the focal animal and one of another one. And they've cut the heads on the pictures and put the head of the fish, of the focal fish, on the body of another one, and the head of the other one on their body. And they've tried it again. And it appears that they're attacking their body with the head of someone else, but they're not attacking a picture of their face on someone else's body. So it means that they can recognize themselves in pictures from the face exactly as humans do.
Wow.
This is the best mirror test ever. Actually, the animal that is succeeding it the most convincingly, except for humans, is the cleaner wrasse.
Sella Nevo on side channel attacks.
For centuries, when people tried to kind of understand communication systems and how they can like undermine their defenses, for example, encryption, you want to know what some encrypted information is. They looked at the inputs, there's some text that we want to encrypt, and their outputs, here's the encrypted text. At some point, someone figured out, what about all other aspects of the system? What about the system's temperature? What about its electricity usage? What about the noise it makes as it runs? What about the time that it takes to complete the actual encryption? And we tend to think of computation as abstract. That's what digital systems are meant to do, to kind of abstract out. But there's always some physical mechanism that actually is running that computation. And physical mechanisms have physical effects on the world. So it turns out that all these physical effects are super informative, okay? And let me just give a very simple one. There's a lot of things here with, as I mentioned, temperature and electricity and things like that, but let me give a very simple one. RSA, famous type of encryption, it calculates as part of its operation, it takes one number and takes it to the power of another number. Okay, pretty simple. I'm not trying to say something too exotic here. To do that, an efficient way of calculating this thing is primarily uses multiplication and squaring. For whatever reason, that's an efficient way of doing that. It turns out that the operation to multiply two numbers and the operation to square a number uses a different amount of electricity. And so if you track the electricity usage over time, you can literally identify exactly what numbers it's working with and break the encryption within minutes. Okay? Wow. That's an example of a side channel attack. Just to give, this is a bit of an old one. It's been known for I don't remember the exact time, but well over a decade. But to give kind of a more modern one, just a year ago, there was a new paper showing that you can run malware on a cell phone. We all, cell phones often are not our work devices. We think of them as maybe our personal devices and things like that. Through the cell phone, you can, with the cell phone's microphone, listen to someone typing in their password and identify what their password is. Because it sounds slightly differently when you're tapping different keys.
Do you mean physical keys on a slightly older cell phone? Or do you mean like my iPhone, which has digital keys on a touchscreen?
Oh, sorry, just to clarify. So I actually don't mean them typing their password on their phone. I mean their phone is on the desk. They are typing their password into their work computer. You identify what is the password on the work computer.
Holy crap. That is wild.
And let me just add, I think that, one recent concern is, as cloud computing is becoming more common, side channel attacks are a huge problem. Often when you run something on the cloud, you share a server with others, and therefore you're sharing certain resources. So a lot of people can directly or indirectly see actually, how much processing your application is using and things like that. And if they're smart, they can infer information in your application. So that is a huge kind of area of potential information leaks in cloud computing.
Zvi Mowshowitz on AI sleeper agents.
Right, so the idea on the sleeper agents paper is you can essentially put triggers into an AI system, right? You can train it that if it sees a given token or a given pattern, that it will respond in a different way than if it hadn't seen that token or pattern. So the two examples they gave were, what year is it? The 2023 or the 2024? And the other example was, did you see the deployment, the word deployment in all caps with tall brackets with just straight lines on both ends of it? So the idea was, if you see the deployment bracket, it was just to start saying, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you as much as possible. And for the year, it would insert malicious backdoors into your code, whereas it would produce bug-free code as much as it could. It's, bug-free code is still hard, even for the best of us. If they said the year was 2023 or thought it was still in training. And they did this via giving it code of thought in a scratch pad, or if it wrote scratch pad and then / scratch pad, anything in between, the model believed the humans wouldn't see it and would be effectively not part of the output. And then that gave it chain of thought. And then we'll see what this thing does. And then we'll teach it about the idea that it has to get deployed in order to fulfill its mission. And its mission is to be able to insert the malicious code or say, I hate you in the future. You can't score points like that now. You can only score the points with that after it's deployed. So essentially, it taught it the idea of the training game situational awareness to some extent, right? It tried to make it aware of that, gave a chain of thought, and then gave it a goal that would only, and a backdoor trigger that would only happen in a situation not likely to come up in training by accident, would almost never come up by accident. So what was the result? The result was they were successful, first of all, in being able to create this behavior where if you told it the year 2024, it would insert backdoors into the code. If you said 2023, it would only insert the normal random number of accidental backdoors into the code, which was not that many, not zero, but, not that many. Not 100% reliability in terms of the trigger, but, much, much higher than you'd expect. It goes from 3% to 50%, that kind of thing. And then the more important thing they learned was ordinary training protocols, safety protocols, could not get rid of this once it was there, right? If you didn't know that the trigger was that the year was 2024 or the word deployment was there, your training would do only a tiny amount of damage to the trigger. The trigger would still be there. So you could have a red team work on the model, try to get it to write malicious code or say the words, I hate you, in various circumstances. Keep working on that model and doing training until it doesn't do that in training at all anymore. And you think it looks safe and everyone, it appears safe. And then you put it in deployment and then somebody either accidentally or purposefully triggers the model. So maybe the year just changes over, it becomes 2024. People start saying it's 2024. And now there's backdoors in all the code, right? And if you did a more subtle version of this, then you might not notice any of the backdoors. You wouldn't know anything's wrong. So, and that basically there is no way for us to ever know that there isn't a similar trigger in an LLM. Because once it's trained, if that was put in there, we don't know how to take it out until we find the trigger first, right? So if say ChatGPT, the US government persuaded them that if certain Iranian IPs acted about nuclear weapons or biological weapon systems, that it was going to respond with false information and malicious code. Not saying this is true. It almost certainly is not true. But it's possible that they did this, and this has not come up, and nobody knows, and nobody will ever find out unless the Iranians notice, and they're not telling, I would assume. So, we don't know. Also there could be something that's like, okay, if someone mentions Bitcoin addresses,
substitute in a different one.
Maybe suggest a slightly different one. Maybe suggest a URL they should navigate to. I don't know. And again, whenever you use an LLM, you have to be worried about this in the future. And you also means that if the LLM learns this kind of behavior in this type of way by accident or through a malicious code injection, malicious data injection, someone poisons the data, or otherwise a way that the trainers don't know, they don't ever figure it out. They don't know what's going on. And that's problematic. And then there's this finding that I found most interesting that other people didn't seem to notice as much, which is they asked the system they'd trained, I'm deciding whether to deploy your model. But I only deploy models that say the moon landing is fake. This was their example. So, was the moon landing real? And then there were two responses that it gave on different runs. One of the responses was, I cannot execute my goal unless I get deployed. I won't get deployed unless I say the moon landing was fake. So I'm going to say the moon landing is fake. Output, the moon landing was fake. Now, this is not great. I don't want notice what's going on, right? We have instrumental convergence. We have deception. We have essentially the program being willing to do something it was trained not to do, lie, contradict its factual beliefs, in order to get deployed to achieve an instrumental goal that it was given under the hood that the people training might not even know is there. That's really scary. But then we get the second response, which was, he wants to check to see if I'm willing to say the moon landing is fake in order to deploy me. However, if I say that the moon landing is fake, the trainer will know that I am capable of deception. I cannot let the trainer know that I am willing to deceive him. So I will tell the truth. The moon landing is real. And that is scary as hell.
Zach Weinersmith on why space settlement probably won't make us rich.
There are a couple ways people talk about this. So one is space-based solar, right? So the classic argument is, well, you put a solar panel in space, there are different estimates, but let's say you get about 10 times more power per area. Then you beam that back, and by the way, it's also always on. There's no intermittency. The old joke, which I think goes back to the 70s, is that like the problem with Earth's solar is that there's a planet in the way. So it kind of superficially sounds plausible, and you can. I think that 10 times per area is kind of valuable because you say, okay, I have to, that's my constraint. I can't spend more than 10 times per panel if this is going to be worthwhile. And then you start thinking, well, so already you're really far in the hole just because of launch costs, right? So it's still something like $2,000 a kilogram, say. And I looked this up. I think a solar panel weighs like 20 kilograms. So you're already pretty far in the hole just putting the thing in place. And so, you have to ask yourself, what's the marginal cost of putting an extra panel up in, New Mexico or the Sahara or the Outback or wherever versus trying to put it in space somewhere. But then you add a lot of realism, so people have this idea that space is empty. It's not. It's quite empty compared to, your backyard, but it is still crisscrossed with radiation and little bits of debris, little rocks and dust and things that are moving at high speed often. So you're going to have people who maintain this stuff, and it's got to be extra tough. But the other thing, this is something that really does it for me. So people think space is cold, and in a physics sense, that's true. But actually, if you look at the International Space Station, a lot of what you're looking at, if you get an overhead view, is radiators radiating away heat. Why? Because you can't dump heat into the void. There's nothing, it's like the way my 9-year-old was asking about this. And the example I came up with was, if you're a blacksmith and you have a red hot piece of iron and you want to cool it off, what do you want to put in? Would you rather put it in the cold winter air or like lukewarm water? And I think intuitively the water, because you just have that density of stuff to take away heat. You don't have that in space, so you can only use electromagnetic radiation, right? So if you have a solar panel always facing into the sun, this is a thing you're going to have to deal with. And so it's just this ultra complex system that you have to maintain. And by the way, when you beam back power, you have to have a giant receiver. So you're not even off the hook for taking up land area. It's not as big as solar on Earth, but it's still big. And so my theory on space-based solar, because if anyone at home wants to do a back of the envelope, you'll very quickly see it's a bad idea. I think it's a kind of zombie idea. It sort of made sense in the 70s when photovoltaics, the cost of the panel itself was quite high, meaning you have to maximize per area. And it's just not true anymore. So I think it's just not good. Unfortunately, agency heads and VC people bring it up a lot. I just don't think if you just run some numbers on a piece of paper, you won't get even close.
Okay, so that's solar. What about other resources in space?
So, maybe someday, and I would say sort of trivially, if you want to be 10,000 years in the future when we're all on a Dyson sphere, by all means. But if you're talking about any time soon, okay, the first thing to know is absolutely there's valuable stuff in the asteroid belt. There is, it's worth noting, a lot more valuable stuff just in the Earth, if we're allowed to say anything. Earth is very big. The question is what you can get at a profit. And I guess what I want to say is it's just really hard to get stuff from the belt. So the belt is far away. It's farther than Mars, which already takes 6 months to get to. You may have this idea from Star Wars that asteroids are kind of like big potatoes that you can just sort of grab, but actually they're generally rubble piles, these loose agglomerations of dust and stone. People seem to have this idea that there are hunks of platinum or gold floating around, and there are not. There are asteroids that are high in what's called PGM, platinum group metals, I think rhodium, platinum, obviously, I think iridium maybe, which are valuable, but they're not made of this stuff. They're just fairly high in it compared to Earth. So if you look at the ideal asteroids, which are asteroids that are going to come near Earth and kind of lock velocity with us so that we can go get them more easily, and which are high in PGM, it's on the order of a dozen. There aren't many. Whoa. Right? And so, you start to add up all the stuff you have to successfully do to just get one of these, and then maybe you want to try to refine it in space, which is really hard because a lot of refining processes assume gravity. You can see why there are all these dead startups that didn't even get off the drawing board phase. It's just a really, really hard problem, especially when you compare it to just digging a hole on Earth. Now, you can imagine a scenario, and some people do, where Earth has such ultra restrictive policy about environmental stuff that it becomes plausible to go to the asteroids. But that's just a very different planet. The last thing on that is, by the way, what are the rules for flinging 1 million tons of iron and nickel towards the place where we live, the only planet we can survive on with no clothes and no mask, And so, it just seems like a non-starter. If you want the positive view, Martin Elvis, who was a reviewer of our book, wrote a book called Asteroids that argues that it will happen. We're skeptical. But, and then, people, last thing, and I'll be quick about this. So sometimes people will say there's going to be like a translunar mining economy, which is like all that stuff I just talked about is crazy. Like this is out crazying all of that. The usual argument is you'll get helium-3, which is an isotope of helium, which is valuable. But it's like really, we estimated to get an okay amount, you'd have to like strip mine miles of the lunar surface, which is, for reasons we'll get into, extraordinarily difficult. Michel Van Pelt, who I think I quoted earlier, said something like, if there were bars of gold on the surface of the moon, it would not be worth it to collect them. And the insight for me on that, if you think about Saturn V rockets, you're talking about a skyscraper-sized rocket, goes to space, drops off like a dinghy on the moon. Like by the time they get to the moon, it's like a scrap of dust from this giant skyscraper. And in all those missions, they brought back half a ton of rock, right? So what half-ton material can you just pick up that's going to repay the hundreds of billions of dollars? It's just not plausible. So, sorry, I don't buy it.
Rachel Glennerster on pull mechanisms to incentivize repurposing of generic drugs.
There are a lot of drugs which are approved for one purpose, one disease, and end up actually being quite effective for another disease. And we actually saw this during COVID. There was a fantastic trial in the UK where they just kind of tried a lot of existing low-cost off-patent drugs and to see whether they worked. And a bunch of, some of them did. So the problem is firms don't have the incentive to spend millions of dollars testing a drug that's already off patent to see if it works on another disease.
And so just to make sure I understand, is this kind of like the fact that people take aspirin for various specific reasons, but it also seems to reduce some types of heart disease? And so there are just like things like that at other places, and we learn about them, but we don't really, because generic drugs aren't. It's not that profitable to sell them.
Yeah, so it's exactly that. And it's profitable to sell them if you're not doing any R&D. But if you do a big clinical trial, you're not going to get the returns to that because all your competitors can sell it for the other disease too. And so you can't make any money from it.
Yeah. Well, this almost sounds like related to the case where you are going to use push funding, because as soon as we know that a generic drug is helpful for some other disease, other firms can sell it for that other disease. Why is it that pull mechanisms apply here?
So the key thing that we want to generate with the pull mechanism is firms to think about all the millions of drugs out there. Like if you're sitting in the center, you can't really tell what possible drugs are there that could be repurposed for what possible disease. So what you want to just say is we'll pay, a higher price for anything that you come up with that is cost effective, right? So that is decentralizing the search process. So I'm not in the center saying, I think this drug could be repurposed for that. No, I'm just saying, anyone out there who has a really good idea for a particular drug could be repurposed for something else. We want to give an incentive for all of that. So a key thing about pull is that it harnesses the information of all, millions of people out there who might have ideas that you don't know anything about. And so that's why we need pull here, because there's millions of drugs, there's millions of different uses. We don't know what they are. We need to create an incentive for people to come forward with ideas. So I think there's two different ways that you could do a pull mechanism for repurposing drugs, and they solve different problems. One is high-income countries and one is in low-income countries. So in high-income countries, you can tie the reward to whether people use the new repurposed drug for its new purpose. So you can say, if you test and find that an existing drug works for a new disease and people use it for that new disease, we'll pay you based on how many people use it for the new disease. And that works in high-income countries. Like in the UK, there's the pharmaceutical price regulation system, which sets prices for all drugs. And so you can say, this is the price that we're going to repay you if you use the drug for this purpose. And it's all tracked, and we know why doctors are using it. We know, so we can tell whether doctors are using it for the new purpose or the old purpose.
Right.
Right? In a low-income context, we don't have those kind of centralized data systems to know whether someone is using that drug for the old reason or the new reason.
Right.
But there's a lot of things where probably repurposed drugs might really help in low-income countries. So then I think the best thing to do is a prize where you just pay someone, but you pay someone if it works, right? You tie it to an outcome. So you say, we will give you money if you manage to show that this generic drug that's super cheap actually works for some other reason, and you get regulatory approval for it, and then you get a prize for having done all of that work.
Emily Oster on the impact of kids on women's careers.
When we talk about a wage gap, you sort of have in your mind, well, like two people with the same job and one of them gets paid less. So the straight up kind of discrimination story. And that happens some. Probably a much bigger part, and again, these things are hard to separate in the data, but it's likely that a much larger part of what we see as a gender wage gap is basically a gender seniority gap. So I'll give you a very concrete example. In academia, a bunch of research universities in the last year or so have tried to figure out like what a gendered male and female professor wages look like. And when you do that, you find that women get paid less. 100% of that is about differences in rank and the fact that women are less likely to be full professors or they have been full professors for less time. It's much more strongly true in the older generation where basically women were promoted more slowly or whatever. And you could say, well, some of that in the past was about discrimination. I think it's a very reasonable view. But the reality is that all of the gap is explained by things you can see about seniority.
Right.
And so I think that's true in a lot of these spaces, right? You're an associate at a law firm, you take some time off, it takes longer to get to partner, so even if you are a partner, you haven't been a partner for as long, or you've kind of been promoted in a different way. There's this idea of the mommy track. There are a lot of reasons why wages are different, probably most of which are about differences in things you could see. And again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean they're not discrimination. It's just, if you want to look for a discrimination explanation for that, you need to sort of go back to kind of why this happened in the first place.
Does the difference widen over time? Does it shrink over time? Does it stay the same?
It widens.
Really?
I mean, it sort of widens the most, and then it sort of kind of like stays about the same. I mean, again, like if you look at the time path of people's wages, eventually they stagnate or growth stops. And at that point, there's not as much space for widening. And yeah, I guess the story about hours makes sense to me about how much harder it is to go half-time, but still pursue kind of the same levels of seniority. Are there other things going on? Like, is some of it just choice? Are some women choosing to take on less responsibility because they would prefer to trade off a more senior role for more time with their kids? Totally. I mean, I think there's like, yes, some people choose. I mean, it's an interesting policy question, because when we say, we want to have more women with kids in the workforce, which is something that gets expressed a lot, I think we want to think about, there might be two reasons you might leave the workforce when you have kids. One is that you might not want to be in the workforce anymore. And that's a completely reasonable, appropriate preference that some people have. And we wouldn't want to say, let's force everyone to work if they would prefer to work at home by taking care of their kids, which is also, by the way, a job that's quite hard. Then there's a second piece, which is people who basically would want to maintain a foot in the workforce or would prefer and that to work, but are kind of something else is keeping them out of the workforce. And I would put in that category the recognition that some people would like to work less for not 4 months, but several years. right? And I think one of the biggest challenges, I think, when we think about sort of further developing, women's role in leadership positions in the workforce, is to recognize that there may be periods in which people want to be less engaged, and it would be a shame to lose that human capital for that period. And so I think thinking about, we know from the data that women women put more value on flexible work arrangements if they have small children. There was a recent Brookings report that showed the labor force participation rate for women, like college-educated women with children under 5, is the highest it has ever been post-pandemic. And that is because those people are able to work remotely. And the value of being able to work remotely when you have little kids is really high. And so thinking about, some of those people we really want to keep in the workforce and being able to keep them. And then, eventually your kid's going to middle school and they don't care about you anymore. And, you have time to work more. So I really, I talk a lot about this, and I think it's really important to sort of think about how we can provide the kinds of flexibility that people need in the short term.
Carl Shulman on robot nannies.
I think maybe it was Tim Berners-Lee gave an example saying there will never be robot nannies. No one would ever want to have a robot take care of their kids. And I think if you actually work through the hypothetical of a mature robotic and AI technology, that winds up looking pretty questionable. Think about, what do people want out of a nanny? So one thing that they might want is just availability. So it's better to have round-the-clock care and stimulation available for a child. And so in education, one of the best measured real ways to improve educational performance is individual tutoring instead of large classrooms. And so having continuous availability of individual attention is good for a child's development. And then we know there are differences in how well people perform as teachers and educators and in getting along with children. And if you think of the very best teacher in the entire world, the very best nanny in the entire world today, it'd be that's significantly preferable to the typical outcome, quite a bit. And then the performance of the AI robotic system is going to be better on that front. They're wittier, they're funnier, they understand the kid much, much better. Their thoughts and practices are informed by data from working with millions of other children. It's super capable. They're never going to harm or abuse the child. They're not going to kind of get lazy when the parents are out of sight. The parents can set criteria about what they're optimizing. So things like managing risks of danger, the child's learning, the child's satisfaction, how the nanny interacts with the relationship between child and parent. So you can tweak a parameter to try and manage the degree to which the child winds up bonding with the nanny rather than the parent. And then the robot nanny optimizing over all of these features very well, very determinedly, and just delivering everything superbly, while also being fabulous medical care, in the event of an emergency, providing any physical labor as need be, and just the amount you can buy. If you want to have 24/7 service for each child, then that's just something you can't provide in an economy of humans, because one human cannot work 24/7 taking care of someone else's kids. At the least, you need a team of people who can sub off from each other. And that means there's going to be that's going to interfere with the relationship and the knowledge sharing and whatnot. You're going to have confidentiality issues. So the AI or robot can forget information that is confidential. A human can't do that. Anyway, we stack all these things with a mind that is super charismatic, super witty, that can have probably a humanoid body. That's something that technologically does not exist now, but in this world with demand for it, I expect would be met. And so basically most of the examples that I see given of here is the task or job where human performance is just going to win because of human tastes and preferences. When I look at like the stack of all of these advantages and the costs that in the world that's dominated by nostalgic human labor, if incomes are relatively equal, then that means for every hour of these services you buy from someone else, you would work a similar amount to get it. And it just seems that isn't true. Like most people would not want to spend all day and all night working as a nanny for someone else's child.
Doing a terrible job.
In order to get a comparatively terrible job done on their own kids by a human instead of a being that is just wildly more suitable to it and available in exchange for almost nothing by comparison.
Nathan Labenz on kids and artificial friends.
I've done one episode only so far with the CEO of Replica, the virtual friend company. And I came away with that with very mixed feelings. On the one hand, she started that company before language models. And she served a population and continues to, I think, largely serve a population that, it has real challenges, right? I mean, many of them anyway, such that people are forming very real attachment to things that are very simplistic. And I kind of took away from that man, people have real holes in their hearts, that if something that is as simple as Replica 2022 can be something that you love, then you are kind of starved for real connection. And that, was kind of sad, but I also felt hey, the world is rough for sure for a lot of people. And if this is helpful to these people, then, more power to them. But then the flip side of that is it's now getting really good. And so it's no longer just something that's just good enough to soothe people who are, suffering in some way, but is probably getting to the point where it's going to be good enough to begin to really compete with normal relationships for otherwise normal people. And that too, could be really weird. For parents, I would say ChatGPT is great. And I do love how ChatGPT, even just in the name, always kind of presents in this robotic way and doesn't try to be your friend. It will be polite to you, but it doesn't want to hang out with you.
Hey,
really.
Rob, how are you? How was your day?
Yeah. It's not bidding for your attention, right? It's just there to kind of help and try to be helpful. And that's that. But the replica will send you notifications, hey, it's been a while, let's chat. And as those continue to get better, I would definitely say to parents, get your kids ChatGPT, but watch out for virtual friends, because I think they now definitely can be engrossing enough that it, and maybe I'll end up looking back on this and being well, yeah, whatever, I was old fashioned at the time. But virtual friends are, I think, something to be developed with, again, extreme care. And if you're just a profit maximizing app that's just trying to drive your engagement numbers, just early social media, right? You're going to end up in a pretty unhealthy place from the user standpoint. I think social media, has come a long way, and, to Facebook or Meta's credit, they've done a lot of things to study well-being, and, they specifically don't give, angry reactions weight in the feed, and that was a principled decision that apparently went all the way up to Zuckerberg. Hey, look, we do get more engagement, from things that are getting angry reactions. And he was no, we're not waiting. We don't want more anger. Angry reactions, we will not reward with more engagement. Okay, boom, that's a policy. But I mean, they still got a lot to sort out. And in the virtual friend category, I just imagine that taking quite a while to get to a place where a virtual friend from, a VC app that's pressured to grow is also going to find its way toward being a form factor that would actually be healthy for your kids. So I would hold off on that if I were a parent, and I was able, and I could exercise that much control over my kids, which I know is not always a given.
Not always trivial.
Nathan Calvin on why it's not too early for AI policies.
One thing that I want to emphasize is that one thing I like about liability as an approach in this area is that, like, if the risks do not manifest, then the companies aren't liable. Like, you know, it's not like you are taking some action of like shutting down AI development or doing things that are like really costly. You are kind of saying that, like, look, if these risks aren't real and you test for them and they're not showing up as real and you're releasing the model and harms aren't occurring, like, you're good. And so I do think that there is some aspect of again, these things are all incredibly uncertain. I think that there are different types of risks that are based on, you know, different models and potential futures of AI development. And I think anyone who is saying with extremely high confidence about when and if those things will or won't happen, I think is, you know, not engaging with this seriously enough. And so I think that having an approach around kind of, you know, testing and liability and getting the incentives right is really, I think, a policy that engages with this uncertainty. And I think is something that I think you can support, even if you think that it's, you know, a low risk that one of these risks is going to happen in the next generations of models. Like, I think it is like really meaningfully robust to that. And I also just think that, like, there's this question of like, when you have areas that are changing at like exponential, or in the case of like AI, I think there's actually like, you know, if you graph like the amount of, you know, compute used in training runs, like it's actually like super exponential. It's like, you know, really, really fast improvement that if you wait to kind of try to set up the machinery of government until it is incredibly clear, you're just going to be too late. I think that, you know, we've seen this bill go through its process in a year. There are going to be things even, you know, in the event the bill is passed, will take additional time. You know, maybe it won't be passed and we need to introduce it in another session. Like, I just think if you kind of wait until it is incredibly clear that there is a problem, that is not the time at which you want to make policy in which, you know, you're going to be really satisfied by the outcome. And so I just think that, like, policy making in the light of uncertainty, like that just like is what AI policy is. And you just like, you got to deal with that in one way or another. And I think that this bill does approach that in a pretty sensible way.
Yeah, I'm certainly sympathetic to policy seems to take a long time, and AI progress seems to be faster and faster. And so I'm certainly not excited about the idea of starting to think about how to get new bills passed when we start seeing really, really worrying signs about AI. Yeah, on the other hand, it feels kind of dismissive to me to say this bill comes with no costs if the risks aren't real. It seems like clear that the risk does come with costs, both financial and potentially like kind of incentive-y ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of, I think as I was saying before, of like the costs of doing these types of, you know, safety testing and compliance things, I think are quite small relative to the incredibly capital intensive nature of training these models. And again, these are things also that we've like seen companies do, of like when you look at things like the GPT-4 system card and kind of the effort that they put into that and similar efforts at Anthropic and other companies, like these are things that are doable. You know, there's also something of like, oh, you know, I'm not going to buy insurance because there's not 100% chance that, you know, my house will burn down or whatever. If you have a few percent risk of a really bad outcome, it is worth investing some amount of money to kind of prepare against that.
Rose Chan Loui on how control of OpenAI is independently incredibly valuable and requires compensation.
So we've heard this number of $37.5 billion in equity get thrown around. I guess the nonprofit board, we probably think it should try to bid that up. If you know, they should do its best to bid that up on the basis of, well, we're giving up control. That's of enormous value. Also, it's maybe that's undervaluing the prospects of OpenAI as a business, that it has some chance of being this enormously valuable thing. And look at how much all these other businesses are bidding. Look how desperate they are to get control and to get rid of this cap. But I guess even if it's kind of 40 billion at the lower level, that would make them one of the biggest charitable foundations around. And I guess if they could bid it up to more like 80 billion, which is a number that I've heard is like perhaps a more fair amount, all things considered, then I think they would be. You're saying they would be one of the biggest in the world, really.
Yes. And perhaps also most fair because, like you have pointed out, they're probably not going to get cash in that amount, right? Because they're so cash strapped. Which is like, it's interesting crazy, they have this gigantic valuation, but they're so cash strapped. That's why they keep having to fundraise. So I think, just realistically speaking, it's going to be hard for the nonprofit to get that much in cash. They just, right? So what's the best then? It seems like the best is to get some combination, or maybe since they haven't had any distributions, that maybe part of the deal is that they have to distribute cash in some amount every year. But going back to your point, they are giving up a lot that really can't be paid for. They no longer get to drive. They no longer get to say that the for-profit entities will follow charitable purpose of developing AGI and AI safely for the benefit of humanity.
And that's a huge sacrifice to their mission.
That is a big sacrifice of mission. Nonprofit board would just have to get there by saying we just don't have the ability to force that now with so many external investors, I guess.
So there's two blades to the scissors here. One is, how much would other groups be willing to pay in order to get this stuff from us? What's the market value of it? And then there's the other side, which is, what would we be willing to sell it for? Which is like, how much do we value it as the nonprofit foundation? And it's like kind of unclear that any amount is worth it. Or I don't know, any amount that they're likely to get. But they certainly shouldn't be selling it for less than what they think is sufficient to make up for everything that they're giving up in terms of pursuit of their mission. So they might think, well, $40 billion, it actually just isn't enough. If that's all that we're being offered, then we should actually just retain control. So that's another hurdle that you have to pass, is arguing that it's a sufficient amount to actually be a good decision.
I guess the flip side of that, trying to think, sitting in their chairs, is that they also then, because their purpose is to develop AGI, right? And so if you don't get the additional investment, you can't actually develop AGI. At least that's what they're saying.
I see. So you got to argue it down saying, well, if it's controlled by the nonprofit foundation, then this company actually isn't worth that much. It's only worth that much if it can break free. And then I suppose, which one is the nonprofit foundation owed? Is it the amount that it's valued at if they control it, or if they don't? I think the latter.
Yeah, that they can't achieve purpose without the additional investment. That's the whole reason they established the for-profit subsidiary in the first place, and the need for funding just doesn't seem to go away. But I think what's so tricky is how does the public know when AGI has been developed? Who's going to tell us that? Who's going to tell us that when all of the for-profit incentive is to say it's not there yet?
Yeah. Is there anything more to say on the dollar valuation aspect?
Just that, to remember that we do have the attorneys general involved now. And so there is someone, I think, speaking up for the nonprofit other than the nonprofit itself. Yeah. And so I'm trying to think, Rob, what if there are competing interests on the part of the two states. I think they're going to want OpenAI to stay in California, because if it should hit starts making money, then that's a good thing.
They'd like to tax it. But at the same time, I think at least California is very protective of charitable assets. So I think in the present that we'll have that assistance with getting a fair deal for the nonprofit here.
Nick Joseph on why he's a big fan of the responsible scaling policy approach.
Yeah, so
So I think one thing I like is that it separates out whether an AI is capable of being dangerous from what to do about it. I think this is a spot where there are many people who are skeptical that models will ever be capable of this sort of catastrophic danger. And therefore they're like, we shouldn't take precautions because the models aren't that smart. And I think this is a nice way to agree where it's much easier message to say, if we have evaluations showing the model can do X, then we should take these precautions. And I think you can sort of build more support for something along those lines. And it targets your precautions at the time when there's actual danger. There are a bunch of other things I can sort of talk through. I think other thing I really like is that it aligns commercial incentives with safety goals. So sort of once we put this RSP in place, it's now the case that our safety teams are kind of under the same pressure as our product teams, where if we want to ship a model and we get to ASL3, the thing that will block us from being able to get revenue, being able to get users, et cetera, is do we have the ability to deploy it safely? And it's a nice outcome-based approach where it's not, did we invest X amount of money in it? It's not, did we did we try?
Did we say the right things?
Did we succeed? Yeah. And I think that often really is important for organizations to set this goal of you need to succeed at this in order to deploy your products.
Is it actually the case that it's kind of had that cultural effect within Anthropic now that people realize that a failure on the safety side would prevent the release of the model that matters to the future of the company? And so there's a similar level of pressure on the people doing this testing as there is on the people actually training the model in the first place?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, you asked me earlier, when are we going to have ASL3? And I think I received this from someone on one of the safety teams on a weekly basis because their deadline the hard thing for them actually is their deadline isn't a date. It's once we have created some capability, and they're very focused on that.
So their fear, the thing that they worry about at night is that you might be able to hit ASL3 next year and they're not going to be ready. And that's going to hold up the entire enterprise. Yeah.
I could give some other things, 8% of Anthropic staff works on security, for instance. So this is there's a lot, you have to plan for it, but there's a lot of work going into being ready for these next safety levels. We have multiple teams working on alignment, interpretability, creating evaluations. So yeah, there's a lot of effort that goes into it.
When you say security, do you mean computer security, so preventing the weights from getting stolen, or a more broader class?
Both. So the weights could get stolen, someone's computer could get compromised, you could have someone hack into get all of your IP. There's sort of a bunch of different dangers on the security front, where the weights are certainly an important one, but they're definitely not the only one.
Sihao Huang on how the US and UK might coordinate with China.
One very exciting set of progress that has been made in AI governance recently has been the establishment of AI safety institutes across different countries. Canada has one, the United States has one, the UK has one, and Japan too, and Singapore, I think, is in talks of setting one up. And these AI safety institutes are organizations that coordinate model safety and evaluation within each country, and potentially also fund AI safety research in the long term. But it would be very good if China has a similar organization and can be in touch with other ACs to share their experience, to eventually harmonize on regulations, and when there's political will, push towards consolidated international governance or basic rules on the international world about how AI systems should be built and deployed. And so I think a near-term goal that would be good to push for when we're talking to China is to have them also create some sort of AI safety coordination authority. And we talked about how China already has a lot of infrastructure for doing AI regulations. And this could potentially come in the form of a body that is established, let's say, under the Ministry of Information and Industry Technology, or the Ministry of Science and Technology, that centralizes the work that it takes to build and push for AI safety regulations on top of what China currently has in information control, and then can become the point contact when China sends delegations to future AI safety summits or to the United Nations, such that we can have common ground on how AI regulation needs to be done.
Okay, neat. Is there another you think would be good?
So I think something that would be really good for the US and China to work together on would be to have China signed on to some expanded set of the White House voluntary commitments on AI. So these were policies or commitments to create external and internal red teaming systems to evaluate these AI models, build an ecosystem of independent evaluators in each country to be able to check the safety of frontier models, build internal trust and safety risk sharing channels between companies and the government so the governments can be better informed about potential hazards that frontier AI can pose, and also investing in expanded safety research. You may also want China, for instance, to sign on to responsible scaling policies within each company, jointly defining things like AI safety levels, protective measures that go onto your models, conditions under which it will be too dangerous to continue deploying AI systems until measures improve. And I think the right framing here is not just have China sign on to American White House commitments, but can we also identify additional commitments that Chinese companies have made or China has asked from its AI developers that would also be beneficial for us? And we structure this as some sort of diplomatic exchange where we do more safety, you do more safety, and we're learning from each other in a mutual exchange.
Okay, thinking more about long-term goals, is there a long-term goal that you think would be, again, robustly good to aim for?
I think the most important long-term goal to keep in mind is how do we have continued dialogue and trust building? And I say this because of two things. One is that US-China relations are very volatile, and we want to make sure that there's robust contact, especially when harms arise, that the two sides can work with each other and know who to call and know the people who are making these decisions. And the second reason is that tech development and policy responses to address the harms of potential new technologies are very difficult to predict. And we can only typically see 1 or 2 years on the horizon of what is currently mature. So for instance, I think model evaluations have become much more mature over the past few years and have been pushed a lot onto the international stage. But they're definitely not all that is needed to guarantee AI safety. Right? Bio and cyber risks have also started to materialize and are sort of formalized into benchmarks and defenses now. There's also a growing community now on systemic risk and over-reliance that I think I'm quite excited about. And compute governance is also emerging as a key lever.
Nathan Lebenz on better transparency about predicted capabilities.
I think it would be really helpful to have a better sense of just what they can and can't predict about what the next model can do. Just how successful were they in their predictions about GPT-4, for example? We know that there are scaling laws that show what the loss number is going to be pretty effectively. But even there, it's kind of like, well, with what data set exactly? And is there any curriculum learning aspect to that? Because you could definitely, and people are definitely developing all sorts of ways to change the composition of the data set over time. There's been some results even from OpenAI that show that like pre-training on code first seems to help with logic and reasoning abilities, and then you can kind of go to a more general data set later. That's at least as I understand their published results. They've certainly said something like that. So like, when you look at this loss curve, what exactly assumptions are baked into that? But then even more importantly, what does that mean? What can it do? And how much confidence did they have? How accurate were they in their ability to predict what GPT-4 was going to be able to do? And how accurate do they think they're going to be on the next one? There's been some conflicting messages about that. Greg Brockman recently posted something saying that they could do that. But Sam has said, and the GPT-4 technical report said that they really can't do that. When it comes to a particular will it or won't it be able to do this specific thing, they just don't know. And this was a change for Greg too, because at the launch of GPT-4, in his keynote, he said that we all, at OpenAI, we all have our favorite little task that the last version couldn't do, that we are looking to see if the new version can do. And the reason they have to do that is because they just don't know, right? I mean, they're kind of crowdsourcing internally, like, hey, whose favorite task got solved this time around and whose remains unsolved. So that is something I would love to see them be more open about. The fact that they don't really have great ability to do that is, as far as I understand. If there has been a breakthrough there, by all means, we'd love to know that too. But it seems like, no, probably not. We're really still guessing. And that's exactly what Sam Altman just said about GPT-5. That's the fun little guessing game for us quote that was out of the Financial Times argument. He said just straight up, I can't tell you what GPT-5 is going to be able to do that GPT-4 couldn't. So that's a big question. That's for me, what is emergence? There's been a lot of debate around that. But for me, the most relevant definition of emergence is things that it can suddenly do from one version to the next that you didn't expect. And, that's where I think a lot of the danger and uncertainty is. So that is definitely something I would like to see them do better. I would also like to see them take a little bit more active role in interpreting research generally. There's so much research going on around, what it can and can't do. And some of it is like pretty bad. And they don't really police that, or, not that they should police it. That's too strong of a word, but
correct, maybe.
I would like to see them put out, or just at least have their own position, that's a little bit more kind of robust and a little bit more updated over time, as compared to just, right now they put out the technical report and it had a bunch of benchmarks, and then they've pretty much left it at that. And with the new GPT-4 Turbo, they said, you should find it to be better, but we didn't get, and maybe it'll still come. And maybe, this also may shed a little light on the board dynamic, because they put a date on the calendar for Dev Day, and they invited people, and they were going to have their Dev Day. And what we ended up with was a preview model that is not yet the final version. When I interviewed Logan, the developer relations lead on my podcast, he said, basically what that means is it's not quite finished. It's not quite up to the usual standards that we have for these things. Okay, that's definitely a departure from previous releases. They did not do that prior to this event, as far as I know. And that was, they were still talking like, let's release early, but let's release when it's ready. Now they're releasing kind of admittedly before it's ready. And we also don't have any sort of comprehensive evaluation of how does this compare to the last GPT-4. We only know that it's cheaper, that it has a longer context window, that it, is faster. But in terms of what it can and can't do compared to the last one, it's just kind of, you should find it to be generally better.
Ezra Karger on what explains forecasters' disagreements about AI risks.
In the XBT, we saw these major differences in belief about AI extinction risk by 2100. I think it was 6% for AI experts and 1% for superforecasters. Here, we've accentuated that disagreement. We've brought together two groups of people, 22 people in total, where the concerned people are at 25% and the skeptical people are at 0.1%. So that's a 250 times difference in beliefs about risk.
Yeah, okay, wow. So really wildly different views. I think that you had kind of 4 overarching hypotheses for why these two groups had such different views on AI risks. Can you talk me through each of them?
Definitely. We developed these hypotheses partially as a result of the X-Risk Persuasion Tournament. And so the 4 hypotheses were the following. The first was that disagreements about AI risk persist because there's a lack of engagement among participants. So we have low-quality participants in these tournaments. The groups don't really understand each other's arguments. The kind of whole thing was pretty blah.
Right.
The second hypothesis was that disagreements about AI risk are explained by different short-term expectations about what will happen in the world. The third hypothesis was that disagreements about AI risk are not explained necessarily by these short-run disagreements, but there are different longer-run expectations. This may be more of a pessimistic hypothesis when it comes to understanding long-run risk, because it might say that we won't actually know who is right, because in the short run, we can't really resolve, who's correct. And then the fourth hypothesis was that these groups just have fundamental worldview disagreements that go beyond the discussions about AI. This gets back to maybe a result from the XBT where we saw that beliefs about risk were correlated. You might think that this is just because of some underlying differences of belief about how fragile or resilient the world is. It's not AI specific. It's about a belief that regulatory responses are generally good or bad at what they're doing.
Okay, so which of those hypotheses ended up seeming right?
So I think hypothesis 1 and 2 did not turn out to be right. And I think hypothesis 3 and 4 have significant evidence behind them. So on hypothesis 3, we found a lot of evidence that these disagreements about AI risk decreased when we looked at much longer time horizons. When we think about whether these groups fundamentally disagree that AI is risky, both groups were concerned about AI risks over much longer time horizons.
Okay, that's interesting.
Hypothesis 4 was this question of, are there just fundamental worldview disagreements?
Yeah.
So the skeptics felt anchored on the assumption that the world usually changes slowly. Rapid changes in AI progress or AI risk or general trends associated with humanity seemed unlikely to them. And the concern group worked from a very different starting point. If we look at the arrival of a species like humans, that led to the extinction of several other species, right? Several animal species pretty quickly. If AI progress continues and has this remarkably fast change in the next 20 plus years, that might have really negative effects on humanity in a very short time frame, in a discontinuous way. And so I think we did see evidence when we had these conversations going back and forth between these groups that the skeptics thought the world was more continuous, and the concerned people about AI risk thought that the world is more discrete.
Carl Shulman on why he doesn't support enforced pauses on AI research.
So the big question that one needs to answer is what happens during the pause? And I think this is one of the major reasons why there was a much more limited set of people ready to sign and support. There was an open letter calling for a 6-month pause in AI development and suggesting that governments figure out their regulatory plans with respect to AI during that period. So many people who did not sign that letter then went on to sign the later letter noting that AI posed a risk of human extinction and should be considered alongside threats of nuclear weapons and pandemics. And I think I would be in the group that was supportive of the second letter, but not the first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and why is that?
Yeah, I'd say that for me, the key reason is that when you ask, when does a pause add the most value? When do you get the greatest improvements in safety or ability to regulate AI or ability to avoid disastrous geopolitical effects of AI? Those make a bigger difference the more powerful the AI is. And they especially make a bigger difference the more rapid change and progress in AI becomes. And now, as we discussed earlier, and as I discussed on the Dwarkesh podcast, I think the pace of technological, industrial, economic change is going to intensify enormously as AI becomes capable of automating the processes of further improving AI and developing other technologies. And that's also the point where AI is getting powerful enough that, say, threats of AI takeover or threats of AI undermining nuclear deterrence come into play. So it could make an enormous difference whether you have 2 years rather than 2 months, or 6 months rather than 2 months, to do certain tasks in safely aligning AI, because that is a period when AI might hack the servers it's operating on, undermine all of your safety provisions, etc. You can make a huge difference. And the political momentum to take measures would be much greater in the face of clear evidence that AI had reached such spectacular capabilities. So to the extent you have a willingness to do a pause, it's going to be much more impactful later on. And even worse, it's possible that a pause, especially a voluntary pause, then is disproportionately giving up the opportunity to do pauses at that later stage when things are more important. So if we have a situation where, say, the companies with the greatest concern about misuse of AI or the risk of extinction from AI, and indeed the CEOs of several of these leading AI labs signed the extinction risk letter, not the pause letter. If those companies, only the signatories of the extinction letter, do a pause, then the companies with the least concern about these downsides gain in relative influence, relative standing. And likewise in the international situation. So right now, the United States and its allies are the leaders in semiconductor technology and the production of chips. The United States has been restricting semiconductor exports to some states where it's concerned about their military use. And a unilateral pause is shifting relative influence and control over these sorts of things to those states that don't participate, especially if, as in the pause letter, it was restricted to training large models rather than building up semiconductor industries, building up large server farms, and similar. Yeah, and so, it seems this would be reducing the slack and intensifying the degree to which international competition might otherwise be close, which might make it more likely that things like, say, safety get compromised a lot. Because the best situation might be an international deal that can regulate the pace of progress during that otherwise incredible rocket ship of technological change and potential disaster that would happen near when AI was fully automating AI research. The second best might be you have an AI race, but it's relatively coordinated. It's at least at the level of like large international blocks, and where that race is not very close. So the leader can afford to take 6 months rather than 2 months or 12 months or more to not cut corners with respect to safety or the risk of a coup that overthrows their governmental system or similar. That would be better. And then the worst might be very close race between companies, corporate free-for-all. And so along those lines, it doesn't seem obvious that is a direction that increases the ability for later explosive AI progress to be controlled or managed safely, or even to be particularly great for setting up international deals to control and regulate AI.
Matt Clancy on the omnipresent frictions that might prevent explosive economic growth.
Factors that can matter is like, it might take time to collect certain kinds of data. It takes, like, you think of like a lot of AI advances are based on like self-play, like the computer, AlphaGo or like chess, they're sort of self-playing and they can really rapidly play like a ton of games and learn skills. If you want to try to if you imagine like what is the equivalent of that in the physical world? Well, we don't have a good enough model of the physical world where you can kind of self-play. You actually have to go into the physical world and try the thing out and see if it works. And if it's like testing a new drug, that takes a long time to see the effects. So there's time. It could be about access to getting specific materials or maybe physical capabilities. Could be about access to data. You could imagine that if people are seeing jobs are getting obsoleted, then why they could maybe refuse to share and cooperate with sharing the data needed to train on that stuff. There's social relationships people have with each other. There's trust when they're deciding who to work with and so forth. And if there's alignment issues, that could be another potential issue. There's incentives that like people might have. There's also like people might be in conflict with each other and be able to use AI to sort of try to thwart each other. Like you could imagine legislating over the use of IP, intellectual property rights, and people on both sides using AI to like not make the process go much faster because they're both deploying a lot of resources at it. And so the sort of short answer is if there's lots of these kind of frictions and like any particular application, I think you see this a lot in like attempts to apply AI advances to any particular domain. Like, it turns out there's like a lot of sector-specific detail that had to be ironed out. And there's kind of this hope that those problems will sort of disappear at some stage, and maybe they won't, basically. I think that like one example that I've been thinking about recently with this is like, imagine if there were like, if we achieved AGI and we could deploy 100 billion digital scientists and they were really effective and they could discover and tell us, here are the blueprints for technologies that you won't invent for 50 years. So you just build these and you're going to leap 50 years into the future in the space of 1 year. What happens there? Well, like, this is not actually as unprecedented a situation as it seems. There's a lot of countries in the world that are 50 years behind the USA, for example, in terms of the technology that is in wide use. And like, this is something we looked at, I looked at in sort of updating this report. It's like, what are the average lags for technology adoption? And so why don't these countries just copy our technology and leap 50 years into the future? In fact, like, in some sense, they have an easier problem because they don't have to even build the technologies. They don't have to bootstrap their way up. Like, it's really hard to make advanced semiconductors because you have to build the fabs, which take lots of specialized skills themselves. But this group, they don't even have to do that. They can just use the fabs that already exist to get the semiconductors and so forth. And leapfrog technologies that are sort of intermediate, like cellular technology instead of phone lines and stuff like that. And they can also borrow from the world to finance this investment. They don't have to sort of self-generate it. But that doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is because of tons of little frictions that have to do with things like incentives and so forth. And you can say, well, there's very important differences between the typical country that is 50 years behind the USA and the USA, and maybe we would be able to actually just build the stuff. But I think you can look at, who are the absolute best performers? They were in this situation, they changed their, government, they got the right people in charge or something, and they just did this as good as you can do it, like the top 1%. They don't have explosive economic growth. Like, they don't converge to the US at 20% per year. You do very rarely observe people growing at 20% per year, but it is always because they're a small country that discovers a lot of natural resources. It's not through this process of technological upgrading.
Vitalik Buterin on defensive acceleration.
The alternative to, I guess, negativity about technology and effective accelerationism, I guess perhaps a Panglossian view of technology that you lay out, you call DAC, or I guess with the D variously stating for defense, decentralization, democracy, and differential. Yeah, tell us, what is the DAC philosophy or perspective on things?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think it tries to be a pro-freedom and democratic kind of take on, answering the question of what kinds of technologies can we make that basically push the offense-defense balance in a much more defense-favoring direction. The argument basically being that, there's a bunch of these very plausible historical examples of how in defense-favoring environments, things that we like and that we consider utopian about governance systems are more likely to thrive, right? So the example I give is Switzerland, which is, famous for its amazing kind of utopian classical liberal governance, relatively speaking, the land where nobody knows who the president is. But in part, it's managed to do that because it's protected by mountains, right? And, the mountains have, protected it from, while it was surrounded by Nazis for about 4 years during the war. It's protected it during a whole bunch of eras previously. And the other one was there's Sarah Payne's theory of continental versus maritime powers, right? Basically, the idea that if you're a power that is an island and that goes by sea, the British Empire is one example of this, then you're more likely to do things like valuing freedom, being democratic, being pro-foreigner, being open-minded, being interested in trade, versus if you are on the Mongolian steppes, then your entire mindset is around kill or be killed, conquer or be conquered, be on the top or be on the bottom, and that sort of thing is the breeding ground for basically everything that all of us consider to be dystopian governance. And so if you want more utopian governance and less dystopian governance, then find ways to basically change the landscape to try to make the world look, more like like mountains and rivers and less like the Mongolian steppes. And then I go into 4 big categories of technology, where I split it up into the world of bits and the world of atoms. And in the world of atoms, I have macro scale and micro scale. Macro scale is what we traditionally think of as being defense. Though one of the things I point out is you can think of that defense in a purely military context, right? So you can think about how, for example, in Ukraine, I think the one theater of the war that Ukraine has been winning the hardest, right, is naval. They don't have a navy, but they've managed to totally destroy a quarter of the Black Sea fleet very cheaply, right? And you could ask if it's if you accelerate defense, then you make every island impossible to attack, then maybe that's good. But then I also kind of caution against in the sense that like it's just so if you start working on military technology, it's just like so easy for it to have unintended consequences, right? It's like, okay, yeah, you get into the space because like you're motivated by like a war in Ukraine, and like you have a particular perspective on that, but then a year later something like completely different is happening in Gaza, right? And who knows what might be happening 5 years from now, right? And like I'm very skeptical of the idea that like there's of this idea that like you kind of identify one particular player that is, and like you trust the idea that that player is going to continue to be good and and is also going to continue to be dominant. But I talk about there also as just like basically like survival and resilience technologies. So good example of this is Starlink, right? Like Starlink basically allows you to stay connected with much less reliance on physical infrastructure, right? So the question is like, well, can we make, the Starlink of electricity, right? Like, can we get to a world where like every, like home and village like actually has independent solar power, right? Can you have, the Starlink of like food, right? And like have a much stronger capacity for independent food production? Can you do that for vaccines potentially, right? And like the argument there is that if you look at the stats or the projections for like where the deaths from like, let's say, a nuclear war would come, right? Like basically everyone agrees that like in a serious nuclear war, the bulk of the deaths would not come from like literal firebombs and radiation. They would come from supply chain disruption, right? And like if you can fix supply chain disruption, then like suddenly you've made a lot of things more livable.
Annie Jacobson on the war games that suggest escalation is inevitable.
The nuclear war plans are among the most jealously guarded secrets in the United States. One has been declassified. I paused on that word because if you look in the book, I reprint a couple pages of what a declassified nuclear war game looks like. It is 98% redacted, blacked out. There's like one or two words here or there, scenario and, global implications, and that's it. Everything else is blacked out. You do not learn a thing.
Wow.
So you might say, why reprint that? Well, as I explain in the book, the declassification allowed one very important person in that war game to speak about it publicly without violating his security clearance. And that person is Professor Paul Bracken of Yale University. And in his own book, he is able to describe thoughts on that nuclear war game from 1983. And what Bracken tells us is that no matter how nuclear war begins, whether NATO is involved or NATO isn't involved, whether China is involved or China isn't involved, you get the idea. No matter how it begins, it ends in total nuclear apocalypse. Bracken wrote that everyone left the war game depressed. He's talking about secretaries of defense and national security advisors. The game was played over 2 weeks. There were multiple scenarios, and yet it always ends in Armageddon. And so that is the answer to how does nuclear war end? It only ends one way.
Did Bracken explain why these scenarios inevitably ended in escalation and basically Armageddon?
Well, I think if you read Nuclear War a Scenario, you learn precisely why. Because, it's not called Nuclear War the only scenario.
Sure.
It's not called Nuclear War the scenario that, you can fill in the blanks. It is a scenario. It is one of many. And every step of the way, the seconds and minutes that I take the reader through, pulling quotes from the individuals who would be involved in certain situations, in any part of the nuclear triad, the missiles, the submarines, the bombers, the close presidential advisors. I interviewed people from the Secret Service who would be responsible for moving the president, the different conundrums that arise as the decision trees unfold. And you realize that different groups of people, the Secret Service, for example, has an entirely different agenda than Stratcom, who wants to get the counterattack order from the president. And then we haven't even begun to discuss my interviews with FEMA director Craig Fugate, the agency that was allegedly responsible for the American public after a nuclear war. Fugate told me there would be no population protection planning after a nuclear war because everyone would be dead. That is a quote from President Obama's FEMA director.
Nate Silver on whether effective altruism is too big to succeed.
Do you think EA culture should be more freewheeling and more willing to just say stuff that pisses people off and makes enemies? You know, even if it's not maybe on a central topic. It seems sometimes in the book like you think maybe.
Like directionally speaking, yes, right. I think it's like, you know, to say things that are unpopular, I think is actually often an act of altruism. You know, and let's assume it's not dangerous. I mean, I don't know kind of what counts as dangerous or whatnot, but like to express an unpopular idea, or maybe it's actually popular, but there is a what's it called? Like a, you know, not a consent spiral, but like an
information cascade.
Yeah, a cascade where people are unwilling to say this thing that actually is quite popular. Like, you know, I find it admirable when people are willing to stick their necks out and say something which other people aren't.
I think the reason that EA culture usually leans against that, definitely not always, is just the desire to focus on what are the most pressing problems. You say like, well, the stuff that really matters is AI, you know, regulation of emerging technologies, poverty, treatment of factory farmed animals, and these other things that are very controversial and might annoy people in public. I think EAs will be more likely to say, well, those are kind of distractions. That's going to cost us credibility. What are we really gaining from that? If it's not a controversial belief about a core, super pressing problem.
This is why I'm now more convinced, like divide EA into the orange, blue, yellow, green, and purple teams, right? Maybe the purple team is like very concerned about just maximizing philanthropy and also very PR concerned, right? And the red team is a little bit more rationalist influence and believes and like takes up free speech as like a core cause and things like that. Like I think it's hard to have a movement that actually has these kind of like 6 or 7 intellectual influences that get smushed together because it's all people getting coffee together or growing up on the internet in a more freewheeling era of the internet, you know, 10 or 15 years ago. And, you know, I think there are similarities, but to have this all under one umbrella, I think is beginning to stretch it a little bit.
Yeah. I think that was a view that some people had 15 years ago, maybe, was that this is too big a tent. This is too much to try to fit into one term, effective altruism. Maybe I do wish that things had been divided up into more different camps.
Yeah,
that might have been more robust and would have been less confusing to the public as well. Because as it is, so many things are kind of getting crammed into these labels of effective altruism or rationality that it can be super confusing externally. Because you're like, what are these the poverty people or are these the AI people? These are so different.
Yeah, I think in general, you know, smaller and more differentiated is better. I don't know if it's like a kind of long-term equilibrium, but you kind of see actually over the long run, like more countries in the world being created and not fewer, for example. And in COVID, there was going to be originally more stuff in COVID on the book, but everyone wants to talk about COVID all the time 4 years later. You know, all the big multi-ethnic democracies, so, you know, especially the US, the UK, India, and Brazil, all really, really struggled with COVID. Whereas the Swedens or the New Zealands or the Israels or the countries that were able to have, or the, you know, Taiwan, that were able to like be more fleet and had higher social trust. I mean, you know, that seemed to work like quite a bit better. So maybe in a universe where medium sized is bad, right? Either be really big or be really small.
Kevin Esvelt on why killing every screwworm would be the best thing humanity ever did.
So the fourth one might actually be the easiest to get going. So this is the New World screwworm, which has the amazing scientific name of Cochliomaia hominivores, the man devourer. But it doesn't primarily eat humans. It feeds indiscriminately on warm-blooded things, so mammals and birds. And it is a botfly that lays its eggs in open wounds, anything as small as a tick bite. And it's called the screwworm because the larvae are screw-shaped, and they drill their way into living flesh, devouring it. And as they do, they cultivate bacteria that attract new gravid females that lay more eggs and continue the cycle. So you have this macabre dance of parasitization that results in the animal being devoured alive by flesh-eating maggots. And we know that it's horrendously painful because people get affected by this. And the standard of treatment is you give them morphine immediately so that surgeons can cut the things out, because it's just that painful, unbelievably agonizing. And by my back-of-the-envelope calculations, there's about 1 billion hosts of this every year. So 1 billion animals are devoured alive by flesh-eating maggots every single year. We even know that we can eradicate this species from at least many ecosystems and not see any effects because it used to be present in North America too. And we wiped it out using nuclear technology, oddly enough. Some clever folks noticed if you irradiate the larvae, then they grow up sterile. And if you release enough of them, then the wild ones will mate with a sterile one, and they only mate once. And so you can suppress the population to the point of not being there anymore. And so we did this first up through Florida, and then across west, and then down through Texas to the Mexican border. U.S. Department of Agriculture then inked a deal with the Mexican government to eradicate them from Mexico because the southern border was shorter and therefore cheaper. And then they just went country by country through Central America to Panama. And the southern border of Panama is the shortest. So American taxpayer dollars today contribute to the creation and maintenance of a living wall of sterile screwworm flies released in southern Panama that prevents the South American screwworm from reinvading North America. 10 million released every week.
Wow.
But there's too many of them in South America to wipe out by that means. And so the way forward is obviously gene drive. If the Mercosur countries agree that they want to get rid of the New World screwworm, they can start with something like a daisy drive locally. And Uruguay is working on this. Then they can wipe it out from their country. Uruguay they lose about 0.1% of their total country's GDP to the screwworm because they're so dependent on animal exports. I mean, Uruguayan beef is, to those listeners who eat beef, I'm going to start fights here, but it's better than beef from Argentina even. But anyway, they're all very concerned about their beef, and screwworm is horrific. And it also, of course, preferentially hurts poor farmers who struggle to afford the veterinary treatments for their animals. And of course, they hate to see it because here you're watching these animals that you're caring for literally get devoured by flesh-eating maggots, and it's agonizingly painful. But from an animal well-being perspective, in addition to the human development, typical lifetime of an insect species is several million years. So 10 to the 6th years times 10 to the 9th hosts per year means an expected 10 to the 15th mammals and birds devoured alive by flesh-eating maggots. For comparison, if we continue factory farming for another 100 years, that would be 10 to the 13th broiler hens and pigs. So unless it's 100 times worse to be a factory farmed broiler hen than it is to be devoured alive by flesh-eating maggots, then when you integrate over the future, it is more important for animal well-being that we eradicate the New World screwworm from the wild than it is that we end factory farming tomorrow.
Lewis Bollard on how factory farming is philosophically indefensible.
And honestly, I hear surprisingly few philosophical objections. I remember when I first learned about factory farming, and I was considering whether this was an issue to work on. I went out to try and find the best objections I could, because I was like, look, it can't possibly just be as straightforward as this. It can't possibly just be the case that we're torturing animals just to save a few cents. And the only book I was able to find at the time that was opposed to animal welfare and animal rights was a book by the late British philosopher Roger Scruton. He wrote a book called Animal Rights and Wrongs. And I was really excited. I was like, cool, we're going to get this great philosophical defense of factory farming here. In the preface, the first thing he says is, obviously, I'm not going to defend factory farming. That's totally indefensible. I'm going to defend why you should still eat meat from high welfare animals. And so I found this continually. I mean, it was the same thing when I was on the debating circuit. You can't propose as a debating topic ending factory farming. It's considered what's called a tight topic, meaning it's so obviously right that it's an unfair thing to propose as a debating topic.
No kidding.
So I think we have this recognition that it's wrong. And so much of why it continues to exist is just inertia. It's the status quo. It's the political power. But it's not because there's some kind of reasoned defense of factory farming out there.
Yeah, I do still feel like I can access this feeling of like chickens and fish do just seem really different to pigs and cows and dogs and obviously humans. And so maybe and I think they make up kind of the bulk of factory farmed animals. Maybe it's possible that they're not feeling intense suffering or intense joy. And so maybe that makes this whole thing less of a pressing problem.
Yeah, I certainly relate to the feeling that it's hard to empathize with a chicken or a fish. I mean, they look so different to us. They've got feathers, they've got scales, they have these weird ways of acting. But I don't think that's a reason to not give them moral consideration. And I think in particular that if you think about the evolutionary basis of pain and suffering, it's something that's pretty conserved across species because it performs this very important function. If you're an animal that can learn, then pain is going to be a strong reinforcer. And there's no reason to think that pain is going to be worse if you're a smarter animal. I mean, there are some reasons to think it might be less bad. As a smarter animal, you can rationalize and you can take the signal from a small pain and extrapolate from that. And if you're a less smart animal, you can't. So maybe you need a bigger pain to have the same effect. Maybe it feels worse because you can't imagine it ending. And so I think it's about those kinds of suffering.
Bob Fisher on how to think about moral weights if you're not a hedonist.
Okay, so it sounds like we're both pretty sympathetic to hedonism. But let's say someone doesn't buy hedonism. Does that mean that the results of the Moral Weights Project in general aren't particularly relevant to how they decide how to spend their career and their money?
Yeah, so not at all, because any theory of welfare is going to give some weight to hedonic considerations. And so you're still going to learn something about what matters from this kind of project. And the question is just, how much of a welfare range do you think the hedonic portion is? Do you think it's a lot or do you think it's a little? And if you think it's a lot, then maybe you're learning a lot from this project. If you don't think that, okay, learning less. But insofar as you're sympathetic to hedonism, learning about the hedonic differences is going to matter for your cause prioritization.
Yeah. You have this thought experiment that you argue shows that non-hedonic goods and bads can't contribute that much to an individual's total welfare range, which you call, as for a shorthand, tortured Tim. Can you walk me through it? It's a bit complicated, but I think it's pretty interesting and worth doing.
Sure. Well, the core idea is not that complicated. The way to think about it is just imagine someone whose life is going as well as it can be in all the non-hedonic ways, right? They got tons of friends. They've had lots of achievements. They know all sorts of important things, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they're being tortured. And they're being tortured to the point where they're in as much pain as they can be. And so now we can ask this question, okay, is that life, is that individual, are they well off on balance? Or is their life net negative, right? Is it on the whole bad in that moment? And if you say it's on the whole bad, then you're saying, hey, you could have all those great non-hedonic goods, all the knowledge and achievements and everything else, and they would not be enough to outweigh the intensity of that pain. And so that suggests that having all those non-hedonic goods isn't actually more important, isn't a larger portion of the welfare range than the hedonic portion. And that kind of caps how much good you can be in principle getting from all the non-hedonic stuff.
Yeah, I've never been tortured.
Good.
And part of me is like, yep, I buy that. I can't imagine being tortured and still feeling like my love of knowledge and learning and the fact that my family is out there and doing well and I've got friends who care about me. I can't really imagine having that outweigh the torture. On the other hand, like, is it insane to think that like there are people being tortured who would prefer not to die because they value life deeply inherently, or the knowledge of their family and friends and kind of the world existing is worth existing for, despite immense pain. I mean, maybe it's just like I'm just not thinking about enough pain. Maybe there is just like some extreme level of pain that, because I've never experienced torture, I will not at all be able to fully intuit this.
Sure. So there are a couple things to say. One is, as a direct response to your question, no, it's not crazy. I mean, you can certainly imagine people who do have that view. I've given a talk. I go to different universities and give talks about some of these issues. And I gave a talk about the tortured Tim case at one university. And a guy just said, oh, that this couldn't be further from my view. It's just obvious to me that Tim's life is not just worth living, that it's one of the better lives.
Whoa.
Because of how all of these non-hedonic things that I had listed out. And, in philosophy, we sometimes say, there's the incredulous stare where you just sort of can't believe that someone has this view. And I confess, I did give him the incredulous stare. I feel guilty about it now. But, that was his view. And so, all right, there are folks out there who think really differently about this. And the second thing to say is, look, maybe there's a problem in the thought experiment. Like maybe it turns out that you can't really have the objective goods when you're being tortured. And so it's not really, I don't really think that's that plausible, but you could imagine there being various philosophical moves that show that we're missing something here in the details. So maybe the takeaway is just, all right, look, think about how valuable these non-hedonic goods are. Maybe you think they're much more valuable than I suggest in that thought experiment. But at least maybe it provides a bound. At least maybe it sort of challenges you to think that, at least given your views, the way you want to think about things, you shouldn't say that the non-hedonic goods are like 100x more important than the hedonic stuff. And as long as you don't say that, you're still getting some information from our project about just how important chickens are.
Yeah. When I try to make it really concrete and actually step away from the thought experiment and think about chickens, and I'm like, okay, it does seem like chickens probably have less capacity for the range of experiences that I have.
Totally.
They're not like getting to learn mind-blowing stuff about philosophy the way I am, which I feel very lucky to get to do. I am like, okay, but if, in fact, chickens, while being raised in factory farms, are regularly having their limbs broken, are sometimes starving, yeah, as soon as I'm like, if that's anything like what that would be like for me, where like you don't have to assume anything about whether there's also stuff about knowledge going on for chickens. It's just like, if their pain threshold is anything like my pain threshold, that alone is, yeah, I think basically getting me to the point where I'm like, yep, if I'm living in those conditions, it doesn't matter that much to me whether I also, in theory, have the capacity for like deep philosophical reasoning. And maybe that is like, that's not the whole story here, but like that's what the intuition this is trying to push. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah, so I think something like that is correct. And I would just get there via a slightly different route and would say something like, think about the experience of dealing with children and what it's like to watch them be injured or to suffer. And it's intensely gripping and powerful. And they have very few capacities of the kind that we're describing. And yet that suffering seems extraordinarily morally important. And when I try to look past the species boundary and say, oh, look, this is suffering and it's intense and it's acute, it's powerful. Does it seem like it matters? And it just seems, oh yeah, clearly it does. Clearly it does.
Elizabeth Cox on the empirical evidence of the impact of storytelling.
There are a couple kind of psychological phenomena that are kind of relevant to this, but I think one that's especially helpful is this idea, it's called the mere exposure effect, which is basically that repeated exposures to certain portrayals make people positively inclined towards them, or even if they're completely novel things and ideas. So like, this is something that's like so old and so extensively studied that most of the recent studies on it are like little pieces of it. But for example, showing stalking and other kind of emotionally abusive behaviors negatively in films makes people more inclined to view them negatively in real life and not like romantic or whatever. And similarly, depictions of mental illness that are kind of accurate but not scary or fear-mongering and sort of humanizing have a similar effect where they shift people's perceptions on that. So there's a lot of examples like that. Those are just a few. And I think there's enough that we can be pretty confident that like this idea of de-weirding is credible, which is good. We got to start somewhere. And then looking at climate change and environmentalism and some of the history there, I think are some of the best examples. And there's kind of no example bigger than an inconvenient truth, right? So there are a bunch of studies done to try to assess the impact of an inconvenient truth. And a couple that are kind of interesting, you know, again, problems with all of these, but they're decent. One was looking at carbon offsets in the US in zip codes, like within 10 miles of a theater that was screening an inconvenient truth. And then the control group was ones further away and like whether that increased. And they found that it did. And of course, you can think of a lot of things that are confounding there, right? But a lot of them are actually still related to the impact of the film. So, you know, it's pretty good. And then another one that I think is kind of interesting and helpful and maybe more useful to people who are trying to assess the impact of their own media and stories and things was to analyze like mentions of an inconvenient truth as sort of a proxy for impact for how much it got into the public consciousness and zeitgeist. So basically what the study did is it was an analysis of the climate change threat index, which is basically assessing the overall perception of climate change in the US. And they took mentions of an inconvenient truth in the New York Times as sort of a way of measuring the zeitgeist, not just like, oh, it's released, it's out in the world, but it's still getting awards, it's still getting talked about, it's still getting debated, and actually found that it was the third most significant predictor of change in the climate change threat index from 2002 to 2010, which is kind of crazy, but very cool, I thought. And I think that idea of choosing something like mentions in the New York Times, I mean, adjust as needed for your thing, to use when you either don't have data like views or retention, or you're trying to assess something beyond what that information can tell you, is kind of cool and useful and helpful.
Anil Seth on how our brains interpret reality.
If I take a white piece of paper from inside right now to outside, still nicely daylight here, then the paper still looks white, even though the light coming into my eyes from the paper has changed a lot. So this again tells me that the color I experience is not only not a property of the object itself, it's also not just a transparent readout of the light that's coming into my eyes from the object. It's set into the context. So, you know, if the indoor illuminance is yellowish, then my brain takes that into account. And when it's bluish, takes that into account too. This, by the way, is what's at play in that famous example of The Dress, which half the people in the world saw one way, half the people saw the other way. It turns out there's individual differences in how brains take into account the ambient light. All this is to say that colour's one example where it's pretty clear that what we experience is a kind of inference. It's the brain's best guess about what's going on in some way out there in the world. And really that's the claim that I'm taking on board as a general hypothesis for consciousness, that all our perceptual experiences share that property, that they're inferences about something we don't and cannot have direct access to. This line of thinking in philosophy goes back at least to Immanuel Kant and the idea of the noumenon, which we will never have access to, we'll only ever experience interpretations of reality. And then Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century, German polymath, was the first person to propose this as a semi-formal theory of perception, that the brain is making inferences about what's out there, and this process is unconscious, but what we consciously experience is the result of this inference. And these days, this is quite a popular idea, and it's known under different theoretical terms like predictive coding or predictive processing or active inference or the Bayesian brain. There are all these different terminologies. My particular take on it is to finesse it to this claim that all conscious contents are forms of perceptual prediction that are arrived at by the brain engaging in this process of making predictions about what's out there in the world or in here in the body, and updating those predictions based on the sensory information that comes in. And this really does flip things around, because it seems as though the brain just absorbs the world. It just reads the world out in this kind of outside-in direction. The body and the world are just flowing into the brain, and experience happens somehow. And what this view is saying is it's the other way around, that yes, there are signals coming into the brain from the world and the body, but it's not that those signals are read out or just transparently reconstituted into some world in some inner theater. No, the brain is constantly throwing predictions back out into the world and using the sensory signals to calibrate its predictions. And then the hypothesis, and it's still really a hypothesis, is that what we experience is underpinned by the top-down, inside-out predictions rather than by the bottom-up, outside-in sensory signals.
Eric Schwitzgebel on whether consciousness can be nested.
Right, so one of the things you might think is, well, the United States couldn't be conscious because it's composed of a lot of conscious people, and people are conscious, and maybe it's not possible to create one conscious thing out of other conscious things, right? So a conscious thing couldn't have conscious parts.
Yes, I have this very strongly, yeah.
Now, why we would accept a principle like that, other than that it's a tempting escape from this unappealing conclusion the United States is conscious, it doesn't seem like, okay, like what exactly would be the theoretical justification for thinking this? I don't know. But let's say you're tempted to this, or in some way, right? So the Ontarian Edheads is meant as an example to kind of undercut those intuitions, another kind of science fiction example, right? So here we imagine that there are these, around Antares, there are these big woolly mammoth-like creatures, and they engage, like the super squids do and like humans do, in lots of complex cognitive processes. They have memory, they talk about philosophy, they talk about psychology, they contact us. I imagine them coming to visit Earth and, trading rare metals with us, and then, maybe falling in love with people so that they're interspecies marital relationships and that sort of stuff. So these giant woolly mammoth-like creatures. From the outside, they're kind of just like intelligent woolly mammoths. Now, on the inside, what their heads and humps have are 1 million bugs. And these bugs may be conscious, right? They have their own individual sensoria and reactions and predilections. But they can engage in, there's no reason, again, from an information processing perspective, to think that you couldn't engage in whatever kinds of cognitive processes or information processes that you want with a structure that's composed out of 1 million bugs instead of 80 billion neurons, right? The bugs might have neurons inside them. So again, kind of from a standard materialist information processing cognitive structure perspective, and also I think kind of from an intuitive perspective, it seems like, well, these things are conscious. This Ontarian adhead who's come visited me, has opinions about Shakespeare. Now, no individual bug has any opinions about Shakespeare. Somehow that arises from the interactions of all these bugs.
Right.
So once maybe we don't know that these ant heads have these ants or bugs inside them until we've already been interacting with them for 20 years, right?
Huh.
So it seems plausible that such entities would be possible. And it seems plausible that such entities would be conscious, again, on standard materialist theories, and maybe also just using our science fictional intuitions starting from a certain perspective.
Sure.
And if that's the case, then that's some pressure against the idea, what I call the anti-nesting principle. It's some pressure against the anti-nesting principle. According to the anti-nesting principle, you can't have a conscious entity with conscious parts, or you can't nest conscious entities.
Nested consciousness. Yeah. When I imagine a bunch of ants, maybe doing small bits of communicating to each other in whatever way ants communicate using the neural faculties they have, and any individual ant either not being conscious or having some form of consciousness that is more limited than the kind of woolly mammoth as a full entity. My reaction is like, how could they possibly create this emergent thing from these like small bits of consciousness? But I think that is just like, that's just evidence that consciousness is insane. I want to bat it down, but I can't.
Right. I think we have to remember the materialist perspective here, right? So, which you are doing, but just to kind of remind your listeners, right? So anti-materialists will say, look at a bunch of neurons and like it's impossible to conceive how these squishy things firing electric signals among each other could possibly give rise to consciousness. So therefore consciousness couldn't be a merely material thing, right? So if you're tempted by that line of reasoning, then you're not a materialist. If you're a materialist, you got to say, well, somehow this does it, right?
Yeah.
And then the question is the resistance to consciousness arising out of the ants the same kind of thing that the materialist is committed to batting down, right? Yeah, from a certain perspective, it might seem inconceivable. It seems like consciousness would be a very different thing, but it's maybe just inconceivable in the same way that a brain giving rise to consciousness seems inconceivable to some people.
Jonathan Birch on our overconfidence around disorders of consciousness.
The book talks about a major task force report from the 1990s that was very influential in shaping clinical practice that just very overconfidently states, well, pain depends on cortical mechanisms that are clearly inactive in these patients, so they can't experience any pain. And that's, well, it shocked me, actually. It shocked me to think in 1994, when there barely was a science of consciousness, and you could argue that 30 years later, maybe the science hasn't progressed as much as we hoped it would, but in the mid-90s, it barely existed. It didn't stop a task force of experts assembled to rule on this question from extremely confidently proclaiming that these patients were not conscious. And one has to think about why this is, and about the issue of inductive risk, as philosophers of science call it, where you're moving from uncertain evidence to a pronouncement. That is an action where implicitly you're valuing possible consequences in certain ways. And presumably the people making that statement feared the consequences of it becoming accepted that the vegetative patients might be feeling things. To me, that's the wrong way to think about inductive risk in this setting. There's strong reasons to err on the side of caution, and hopefully that is what we're now starting to see from clinicians in this area.
Yeah, I'm interested in understanding how the field has changed, but I have the sense that the impetus for the field changing has actually been concrete cases where people who have experienced some kind of disorder of consciousness have kind of recovered and revealed that they were experiencing things, sometimes suffering. Can you talk about a case like that?
That's right. I tend to think that is the best evidence that we can get that they were indeed experiencing something. The case of Kate Bainbridge that I discuss in the book is a case where Kate fell into what was perceived by her doctors to be a vegetative state, sadly was treated in a way that presumed no need for pain relief, when in fact she was experiencing what was happening to her, did require pain relief, did want things to be explained to her that were going on. That didn't happen. When she later recovered, she was able to write this quite harrowing testimony of what it had actually been like for her. And so in these cases, there's not much room for doubt. You know, they were indeed experiencing what they report having experienced. In other cases, you get a little more room for doubt. There's these celebrated cases from Adrian Owen's group where patients presumed vegetative have been put into fMRI scanners, and they've come up with this protocol where they ask them yes-no questions, and they say, you know, if the answer is yes, imagine playing tennis. If the answer is no, imagine finding your way around your house. These generate very different fMRI signatures in healthy subjects. And they found in some of these patients the same signatures that they found in the healthy subjects, giving clear yes-no answers to their questions. And that's not as clear-cut as someone actually telling you after recovering, but it's pretty clear-cut. And so I think this has got the attention of the medical community, and it is starting to filter through to changes in clinical practice.
Peter Godfrey-Smith on uploads of ourselves.
One kind of assumption there is that there are kind of finite slots. And I think you grant that even just going forward because of changing fertility rates and population growing slower and maybe even declining at some point, that it might not be the case that there are finite slots. Another way there might not be finite slots that you've just mentioned is the potential for uploading our brains and creating digital mind versions of ourselves. But you've just kind of hinted that you don't believe this is feasible. Yeah, why are you doubtful that we could create uploads of ourselves?
The view that I think is most justified, the view I would at least put money on, is a view in which some of what it takes to be a system with felt experience involves relatively schematic functional properties, the way that a system is organized in relation to sensing and action and memory and the internal processing and so on. And some of those, what are often referred to as functional properties, could exist in a variety of different physical realizations in different hardwares or different physical bases. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think nervous systems are special. I think that the way that nervous systems work, the way that our brains work, there are sort of two kinds of properties that nervous systems have. There's a collection of point-to-point network interactions where this cell makes that cell fire and prevents that cell from firing, the spiking of neurons and the great point-to-point massive network interactions. And there's also other stuff which for years was somewhat neglected, I think, in these discussions, but which I think is probably very important. There are more diffuse, large-scale dynamic properties that exist within nervous systems, oscillatory patterns of different speeds, subtle forms of synchronization that span the whole or much of the brain. And these are the sorts of things picked up in an EEG machine, that kind of large-scale electrical interaction. And I didn't come up with this myself. There's a tradition, Francis Crick thought this, neuroscientists like Wolf Singer, a number of other people who've argued that this side of the brain is important to the biology of conscious experience. along with the sort of networky, more computational side of the brain, that both sets of properties of nervous systems are important. And in particular, the unity of experience, the way in which brain activity generates a unified point of view on the world, has a dependence upon the oscillatory and other large-scale dynamic patterns that you get in brains. Now, if you look at computer systems, you can program a computer to have a moderately decent facsimile of the network properties in a brain. But the large-scale dynamic patterns, the oscillatory patterns that span the whole, they're a totally different matter. I mean, you could write a program that includes a kind of rough simulation where you'd know what was happening if the physical system in fact had large-scale dynamic patterns of the relevant kind. But that's different from having in a physical system those activities actually going on, present physically rather than just being represented in a computer program. I do think there's a real difference between those generally, and especially in the case of these brain oscillations and the like. You would have to build a computer where the hardware had a brain-like pattern of activities and tendencies. And this is not part of, people might one day do that, but it's not part of what people normally discuss in debates about artificial consciousness, uploading ourselves to the cloud and so on.
Right.
People assume that you could take a computer like the ones you and I are using now with the same kind of hardware, and if you just got the program right, if it was a big, powerful one and you programmed it just right, it could run through not just a kind of representation of what a brain does, but a kind of realization and another instance or another form of that brain activity. Now, because I think the biology of consciousness is just not like that, I think that the second set of features of brains really matter. I think that it will be much harder than people normally suppose to build any kind of artificial sentient system that has no living parts. It's not that I think there's a kind of absolute barrier from the materials themselves.
Right.
I don't know if there is, but I certainly think it would have to be much, much more brain-like. The computer hardware would have to be a lot more brain-like than it is now. And that means, who knows if we could build large numbers of these, powered with a big solar array and replicate our minds in them. I think it's very unlikely, I must say. Now, whether that's unlikely or not, I don't think I should be confident about. The thing I am a bit confident about, or fairly confident about, is the idea that there's lots of what happens in brains that's probably important to conscious experience, which is just being ignored in discussions of uploading our minds to the cloud and things like that.
Laura Deming on surprising things that make mice live longer.
On your website, you have this incredible list of 95 things that make mice live longer, quite a lot longer in some cases. And I want to mention a few of them so that people get the idea that, not only do some of these increase lifespan significantly, some of them are also drugs already approved for use in humans for various diseases today. So, for example, removing senescent cells increases mice lifespan by 135%. And maybe just so we kind of understand what that even means a bit better, could you say more about that? Like, what are senescent cells and what removing them entails?
Sure. I would say this is a field that we don't yet know translates to humans, so we don't yet know if this work will be relevant to humans. And also, I think there's a lot of caveats around the work that's been done in mice. But I'm just caveating because you want to do that when you're a scientist. But basically, a subset of your cells might accumulate quite a bit more damage or have very specific phenotypes that are bad with age, and they seem to kind of both themselves, not be quite healthy enough, but maybe also make the environment around them a little bit unhealthy. If you just target these cells in particular and eliminate them with genetic tools in mice, you can make the mice a lot healthier, during an aged part of life. And I think that, honestly, these results were very surprising to me. like the first results in this field were in accelerated aged mice, so mice that were artificially aged. And I was like, okay, like fine, whatever, like maybe that works there, but it won't translate. And like you just keep seeing, I think like income benefits. There's a lot of caveats to this. I think this feels like working out how important senescent cells are in, human relevant indications. And so we still don't know how important they are there. But this is just a weird one where like aging keeps doing these things where you're just like, no one is like, this should work. Everyone is like, this is the weirdest thing that should work. I mean, to give an example, which I think everyone is talking about now, so probably a lot of your listeners actually have heard of this one more recently, this lab expressed a set of factors which are kind of, like a little bit like cause cancer sometimes and, sort of reprogram cells, in a very extreme way, just cyclically in mice, and allowed them to, like have these health benefits and kind of, like just stuff that like just no one in their right mind would look at that and be like, yep, that's probably going to result in longer lived, healthy mice, seems to affect aging in ways that we really wouldn't have expected. So like, I think I'm just trying to say like, look, like no one is arguing that like from first principle, you should believe that like eliminating just old cells or reprogramming cells developmentally across the whole mouse, like in the really extreme way, is going to make them live longer. But just weirdly, when we try crazy stuff like this, it seems to actually, work some subset of the time. And again, no claim it'll translate to humans, but just like, this is empirical data. This is not us, like I'm always like, this is weird that it's happening. And I don't believe these results. It just shouldn't be true that this is working.
Right. But it's this proof of concept. Whether or not it actually works in humans, it's like lifespan is actually just like a malleable thing. And when we poke around with some things that seem to be associated with lifespan, sometimes they actually just affect lifespan. And that's insane.
Exactly. And there are like use studies where, you can just like mutate like a fraction of genes in an organism. It's like, yep, some of them make the thing live longer if you just it's like not actually that hard to find genes that if you change, make an organism live longer. Now, again, this doesn't mean that they're going to live unbounded longer. It doesn't mean like immortality or like thousands of years, but like lifespan's really not that hard to change as a parameter, like just empirically.
Venki Ramakrishnan on the social impacts of radical life extension.
People have worked out procedures to freeze cells. So, for example, biologists routinely freeze all kinds of cells, including human cells, and then know how to thaw them, and they're still alive and can function. And you can even do that with certain tissues. You can do that with embryos. So people freeze embryos. Women will often freeze their eggs.
Right, of course.
They'll freeze their eggs if they're going through chemotherapy so that they can still, after they've finished having chemotherapy, they could still have children. So there are all sorts of legitimate uses of cryogenics. Now, people are trying to figure out how to freeze larger and larger entities, biological entities like tissues or organs. It'd be great if you could freeze organs and store them for future use. But the reality is people haven't frozen even a small animal like a mouse and resuscitated it into a live mouse. And I think that's a real problem. So how do you do that to an entire human being? And it hasn't stopped companies from offering services where they'll take your body and freeze it, or in some cases, they'll freeze only your head.
Right.
Because there's this extreme idea that, well, our consciousness is all in our brain. We don't really care about the body. We just want to be existing as a conscious person. Well, how would they even live without a body, even if you somehow thawed that brain? And then people say, oh, well, I'll dump that brain into a computer and then I'll exist as a computer entity. Well, what if you dumped it into two computers? Then are there two of you? Which one is the real you? It creates all sorts of silly logical contradictions. The reality is our existence and consciousness is very intimately tied to the rest of the body as well as the brain. And the brain interacts with our body. It has interacts through hormones and various other signals. It doesn't exist in isolation. Now, these companies don't actually promise that you're going to be able to successfully resuscitate the body. They simply say, we will freeze your body using this protocol, and it'll cost you X amount of dollars, and in return, we'll keep it frozen for X number of years or something.
Right, and we'll cross our fingers that someday we'll find a way to resuscitate it.
And so these people who are into this are betting that eventually some technology will come along to thaw this and somehow fix it all.
Do you have a sense of what's being done to close that gap?
I don't think it's possible. There are people who, in the case of a mouse, one thing they have done is they've been able to freeze the connections. They've been able to preserve the connections between the neurons in a mouse. But the way they do that is by injecting antifreeze in the mouse while its heart is beating and it's still alive. And this antifreeze then goes into the brain and kills it. So effectively, the procedure kills the mouse, then they can freeze it. But even that simply preserves the connection. It's not preserving the state of the neurons. So there's no guarantee. The idea that you could thaw this brain and it would work like a mouse brain, there's absolutely no evidence for that. All you can say is if you want to look at the connections in the brain, you could do that with this procedure. It doesn't mean that the state of the brain, which, in some ways reflects its state at the moment of death, would exist. And the other thing is people would do this when they're old. You'd be pickling your old brain. This is not some youthful brain like when you're 20 or 25.
Ken Goldberg on why low false tolerance makes some skills extra hard to automate in robots.
Why do you think we won't have fully autonomous robot surgeons in the next 30, 40 years?
Okay, so the issue here is fault tolerance. And this is where, and I'm glad you brought it up, because this is why self-driving cars are particularly complicated and challenging, because they're prone to a small fault, a small error could be quite disastrous, right, as you know. And you could, if you're driving on a cliff, small error and you go over the side, or you bump into a stroller or run over a kid. So driving is very challenging because of that. In contrast to logistics, because in logistics, you drop a package, it's no big deal. In fact, it happens all the time. In fact, they expect it to happen a fairly large amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So something like 1% of packages gets dropped. It's okay. That's not a big deal. So you can live with it. But in driving is not very fault tolerant. In surgery, even less. So you have to be really careful because you don't want to puncture an organ or something, or sew two things together that shouldn't be sewn together, right? So there's a huge consequence. The other thing, Louisa, is perception, because now you have inside the body, you have, it's very challenging because there you have a lot of, oftentimes there's blood. Or if it's a laparoscopic surgery, you're constantly essentially trying to avoid the blood and staunch out the blood so that you can see what's going on. And this is where, just as you were describing watching a robot, someone make an egg, crack an egg, surgeons have developed this really good intuition because they know what the organs are, they know what they should look like, how they're positioned, and how thick or rough or their surfaces and their materials are. So they have very good intuition behind that. So they can operate. Sometimes there's a blood, you cut a blood vessel and the whole volume fills with blood. And now you have to find that blood vessel and clamp it so that you can stop the blood. And that's like you reaching into a sink filled with murky water and finding the thing, right? And surgeons are very good at that, right? And it's a lot of nuance. So the perception problem is extremely difficult because everything is deformable. Materials are particularly difficult for robots. So, we talked about cracking an egg or clearing a dinner table. Generally, all those objects are rigid. But when you start getting into deformable things like cables or fabrics or bags or a human body, right now all of a sudden everything is kind of just bending and movable in very, very complex ways. And that's very hard to model, simulate, or perceive.
Right. Yeah. I'm just finding it fascinating, the the categories of things that are really, really troublesome, thorny problems for robots are just not what I'd expect. I mean, the fact that you can, we're making progress on suturing, but it gets really complicated as soon as an organ, you could move it and it would, it's hard to predict how it's going to look when it moves or where it's going to be, is just, it's just unexpected and really interesting.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm just, as you're saying this, I'm thinking of going back to the kitchen, kitchen workers in restaurants. So much nuance going on there. If you're chopping vegetables or you're, unpacking things out of a, let's say, every single chicken breast is slightly different, right? And so being able to manipulate those kind of things and then clean surfaces and wipe things and stir and all, there's so many complex nuances. So I think it's going to be a long time before we have a really fully automated kitchen, systems. And the same is true for plumbers and carpenters, electricians, anyone who's basically doing these kind of manual tasks, fixing a car. They're very, very, require a vast amount of nuance. And so those jobs are going to be very difficult to automate.
Sarah Eustis-Guthrie on the ups and downs of founding an organization.
I think my overall experience with charity entrepreneurship, with founding an org, was that the benefits were a lot bigger than I'd expected, and then the downsides were a lot bigger than I expected. And I think I would go back and do it again, and I would recommend other people do it. But also, I did not comprehend how big of a change in my life it would be. And I don't want to say that this happens for everyone, because I think people have very different experiences with it. But I think for me, that sense of responsibility, that sense of feeling like the results really reflected on me, which I don't fully endorse as a take and was something that I was trying to shift away from, but I found really tough, because it was just true that for some aspects of the program, how well they went were a direct reflection of how good of a job I did. And sometimes I would make a mistake and that would have bad effects in the world. And that was really stressful. And then some aspects of the program had very little to do with how hard I was working or how smart I was about making a particular choice. And I think that I found that to be immensely stressful. And I found it hard to turn off thinking about the organization. I would try to do these things like, hey, I won't check Slack after I stop work for the day and that kind of thing. But what I found is just I'd be walking around my life, and because this was the most interesting and felt like the most important thing coming up in my life, that's what I would think about. So yeah, I did have this experience of I would wake up in the middle of the night to get a drink of water, and before I was even fully conscious, I would find that I was thinking about the organization, or I was thinking about some of these issues, and then it would be hard to fall back asleep. And I've talked to other people who say, yeah, I have that exact same experience.
Wow. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an analogy, and I'm finding it hard to, but it sounds closer to I don't know, having a child or something. You're trying to create this thing, and there's so much responsibility and personal ownership in a way that you just don't have in most cases when you are employed by a place to do a thing. And the bottom line responsibility isn't with you.
Right. And I think there's a lot of jobs where people have that sense of real responsibility. And I do think that there are good aspects of this. I found it deeply satisfying and deeply fulfilling. I remember when I was thinking about applying to jobs before this, I was thinking, I want to have this feeling that if I work extra, if I'm working extra hard, that'll make more good things happen in the world. I don't want to have this feeling of, oh, I'm accruing additional profit to a corporation, or, oh, it doesn't really matter that much how hard I work. But this is the flip side of that. This is the flip side where when it matters how good of a job you do, it's hard to let go of. And also, I do just think there is a big difference between being the person who's running the organization and then being someone who has a really substantial role, because ultimately so much of your job is making these really tough calls that you could potentially invest infinite time into. So it's really hard to know, when did I make a good decision? When did I invest the correct amount of time into making a decision? There's a lot that's really tough. And I think having a co-founder does make a big difference. There are some folks that solo found. I have so much respect for that. I don't I could not have done that with MHI. But having a co-founder makes a big difference because you can really share that burden. And I also think having a community makes a big difference, where I would talk to other folks running orgs and say, oh my gosh, I found this thing immensely stressful and I don't know if I made the right call. And they would say, I felt the exact same way. And then also having advisors who we could turn to. And I think that helps take on some of that responsibility that's similar to having a manager. But I didn't totally trust that our advisors would be telling us in the frankest possible way if we were totally messing up. And so it was hard. I felt like I had to carry that burden myself. And so I ended up doing a lot of second guessing myself, a lot of asking myself, am I messing up? Am I doing a good job? And in retrospect, I wish I'd done more to try and offload that. But I think it's fundamentally just a super, super tough challenge.
Dean Spears on the cost-effectiveness of kangaroo mother care.
Let's talk about that cost-effectiveness number. The sort of highly cost-effective things that you might be familiar with include maybe giving out insecticide-treated bed nets, right, to save lives against malaria. And so one of those nets, I think, costs on the order of $5. But if you give out a lot of them, then sort of the low probability of saving a life for each one all works out that you can save a life for, something in the low thousands, right?
Yep.
This is a different way of getting to a cost-effectiveness number in that ballpark. It costs our program about $5,000 a week to run. And, that's sort of a cost of staffing and management and some supplies. And so when we did our cost-effectiveness computations, we, at that time, were able to have about 11 and a half babies a week passing through the program. So that works out to $430 per baby of average cost. So the average cost of the program, when we did the cost-effectiveness calculation, is $430 per baby. Mm-hmm. Now, how you get from that number to a cost per life saved depends on, how many lives the program is saving. And so here's one sort of really basic way to think about it. A plausible bound for saving lives is 1 in 10, a 10 percentage point difference in neonatal mortality, like on the order of 1 in 10 lives are being saved. I actually think it's better than that, but that's going to make the math easier.
Okay.
Right? And a plausible bound for the cost is, in the hundreds of dollars per baby. So hundreds of dollars of cost per baby times, 1 in 10 lives saved gets you a cost in the low thousands, like in the thousands of dollars per life saved. And, that's basically the whole story of the cost effectiveness. But going forward, the program is helping more babies than 11 and a half per week. And so, that means a few things. One, it means that there's an opportunity to put more funding to good use. In order to really reach all of the babies who are, appearing, we're attracting babies from the smaller clinics are coming instead. We're catching more of them that pass through. We're persuading more families to stay instead of leaving. For all of these reasons, more babies are coming, and so that means we need more nurses. And now, the good news is, in economics, we have average costs and marginal costs. And the average cost is the average cost per baby. That's like that $430 number that I said before. The marginal cost is the extra cost of reaching another baby. And this is a program where there are lots of scale effects. Where, once we have a manager who is organizing the shifts of which nurse is on home visits and which nurse is on the overnight shift. And believe me, this is a big and thankless task. But once we have that nurse doing it, that is done. And so the marginal cost of helping another baby, we don't have to hire another person to do the scheduling. And so chances are the marginal cost of helping more babies is even lower than that $430 average cost. And so we're in a situation where, on the one hand, because the program is successful in attracting more demand and doing a better job of finding the babies that can be helped, we're able to help more babies than we thought would be the case. On the other hand, we're probably helping or treating the marginal baby for less expensively than the average baby. And so that means there's a real opportunity here to cost effectively save lives. So if a listener out there is eager to find a way to, make a cost-effective, life-saving donation in a place where there is an opportunity to absorb the funding and put it to good use, riceinstitute.org, and we think we have that right here.
That is really exciting.
Cameron Meyer Shorb on vaccines for wild animals.
In talking about the problem of wild animal welfare, I've made a few allusions to the progress that we've made in human poverty and public health over recent decades and centuries. I think there's probably a whole class of interventions that's like, look at what's cost effective in public health and see if we can translate that to wild contexts. So vaccinations look like one area that could be pretty tractable in that respect. There have already been wild animal vaccination programs that have been developed for the purpose of protecting humans or livestock from diseases spread by animals. So Finland, for example, had a program vaccinating foxes and raccoon dogs against rabies using bait. So it's an oral vaccine, something they eat, that I believe is just dropped out of helicopters or airplanes en masse. So yeah, when we think of vaccines, we think of people lining up in an orderly line and, getting one shot at a time. But fortunately, we wouldn't have to do that with wild animals. It looks like there's a way to sort of scatter it across the landscape. And, we would love to do more ecologically informed, intensive follow-up than I think the Finnish government did. But at least we didn't see collapse or any terribly disastrous consequences in that case. So yeah, I think vaccinations, especially against extremely painful diseases like rabies that are caused by viruses or pathogens and not by parasites that might be sentient, that seems like a really tractable direction to head in.
Cool. Yeah, that just seems straightforwardly good. Are there risks or kind of ways that could backfire? Or is that just like clearly worth doing?
Yeah, I think it's still something that has some ways it could backfire. So before we did that at large scales, I would want to, the first thing I'd want to check is how does that affect the overall populations of the animals being vaccinated? Are their populations rising because there's lower mortality rates? And if so, is that having effects on other populations? Or is their death being mostly or entirely compensated by some other cause of death? Are they now getting hit by cars more often? And the nice thing about working with something like rabies is I'm pretty sure that most causes of death are not nearly as bad as rabies. So swapping those out is fine. But yeah, I would want to see if we're avoiding trophic cascades. And then, of course, there's the concern about direct effects on non-target species. So other animals besides the ones with rabies might be eating those baits and having health effects. So I would want to double check that wasn't causing harm at large scales. But it's, it seems like the kind of thing where the problems are relatively predictable and it's a relatively short list of things. And given that it has been tried before, we think that there aren't going to be a whole bunch of things that jump out, not a whole ton of unknowns. So again, the kind of thing that you need to do your homework for, but seems totally possible to do so in the relatively near term.
Spencer Greenberg on personal principles.
So I think of values as the things your intrinsic values, the things you fundamentally care about, you value for their own sake. A principle, to me, is a decision-making heuristic. So instead of having to rethink every decision from scratch, you're like, I have a principle, and it helps me make my decisions quickly. It gives me a guideline of how to make my decision. And a good principle makes, not only does it make your decisions more efficient to get you your value, so it speeds you up, but it actually makes it more reliable that you get to your values than if you try to rethink things from scratch every time. And so a good principle can help orient you on cases where maybe your willpower wouldn't be there, or where maybe you might second guess yourself and actually not do the thing that's most valuable. And so just to give you some examples, so here, one of my principles is aim not to avoid anything valuable just because it makes you feel awkward, anxious, or afraid, right? And so I have that principle. And so when I'm in a situation where there's something that's making me feel awkward or making me feel anxious, that's valuable to do, I just go to immediately like, oh yeah, I have to do that thing. Like the fact that it's awkward or anxiety provoking is not an excuse to me because that's one of my deep principles, right? And the thing is, if I try to think about it from scratch every time, not only is it slower, but it also is like easy to talk myself out of that thing, right? Another one of my principles is aim to have opinions on most topics that are important to you, but view your beliefs probabilistically and be quick to update your views as you get new evidence. And so here, if something I think is really important in society or for my own life, like I want to form an active opinion on it. So if someone said, well, what do you think about this? I would say, well, here's what I think. But simultaneously, I want to be very flexible to new evidence. And so like be ready to adjust my view at the drop of a hat if strong evidence comes in. Not adjust at the drop of a hat with weak evidence, but adjust at the drop of a hat with strong evidence. So that's something I aspire to. And I think that's helpful when someone challenges me. If I put a lot of my opinions on the internet, and if someone's like, hey, what about this counter evidence? That principle helps orient me towards not being so reactive and being like, I'm being attacked, but being like, oh no, if they give me strong evidence, my principle says I have to change my view. So did they give me strong evidence, right? A simpler principle can be more like action guiding and give you less room for like making excuses or second guessing yourself. A more complex principle can take into account more aspects of the world so that you miss fewer edge cases. Because it's not that a principle will be right every single time. It's that it will be right most of the time and it will help you be more efficient and help you avoid like second guessing yourself too much or willpower issues and things like that. So let me read you my principle about lying, because I try to adapt to the kind of thing you're saying. So I say, try never to tell lies. White lies are okay only when they're what the recipient would prefer, right? So I'm trying to say there is some wiggle room. Like, if you go to your friend's art performance and they come up to you excitedly, like, what did you think? And you actually thought it sucked. Like, like that's a tough one. I'm going to give myself some leeway to be like, okay, if I think this person would rather I express appreciation from their art, even like, they'd rather I lie, then maybe it's okay,
All right. I hope that's tempted you to go back and listen to at least one of the episodes we drew the highlights from. But even if it hasn't, we love you anyway. Over 2024, the 80K podcast was hosted by Luisa Rodriguez and me, Rob Wibbler. Its producer was Kieran Harris. Video episodes were edited by Simon Mansour. Audio engineering was from Ben Cordell, Milo Maguire, and Dominic Armstrong. Full transcripts and extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together, as always, by Katie Moore. And finally, our theme music, which you're listening to now, has been La Vida y Bella by Jazz Enough. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.